The stagecoach door swung open with a violence that made the horses stamp and shy. Before anyone in Hardridge's main street could register what was happening, a woman's body came tumbling out onto the packed dirt like a sack of grain someone decided wasn't worth keeping. She hit the ground hard. Dust exploded around her in a choking cloud. The impact drove the air from her lungs in a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her carpetbag followed a second later, bursting open on contact, scattering her meager belongings across the street. A hairbrush with a cracked handle, two carefully folded dresses now streaked with dirt. A small tin that popped open to reveal 3 precious sewing needles. "Stay gone, you worthless bitch," a man's voice snarled from inside the coach. "You ain't fit to carry my name." The door slammed. The driver, who'd been staring straight ahead the whole time like he'd witnessed nothing, cracked his whip. The stagecoach lurched forward, wheels grinding through the dust, and within seconds it was disappearing down the road toward the next town. The woman, Eliza Boone, though she wasn't sure she had any right to that surname anymore, lay where she'd fallen. Her face was pressed against the dirt. She could taste blood and grit. Her left eye was swollen, nearly shut. Purple bruises mottled her arms and throat like someone had tried to paint a map of cruelty on her skin. She didn't move. Not yet. Moving meant acknowledging what had just happened. Moving meant facing whatever came next. Around her, Hardridge went silent. It was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. The street had been busy seconds ago. Women with shopping baskets, men loading wagons, children darting between buildings. Now everyone stood frozen, staring at the woman in the dirt like she was something dangerous that might explode if approached. Eliza could feel their eyes. Each gaze felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, her spine, her already bruised ribs. She knew what they were thinking. She'd grown up in towns like this one. She understood how these places worked. They were judging her, calculating, deciding whether she deserved this or not, deciding whether she'd brought it on herself. "Mama, why's that lady on the ground?" A child's voice, high and curious. "Hush!" The mother's response was sharp, immediate. "Don't look at her. Come away." Footsteps retreated. More followed. The paralysis broke, but not in the direction Eliza had desperately hoped. People weren't rushing to help. They were leaving, hurrying away like she carried some contagious disease that might spread if they got too close. She heard fragments of whispered conversation drifting back toward her. Married what? 3 days ago? Saw them at the station. She looked happy enough then. Must have done something terrible for him to... You don't throw away a wife unless she's broken in some fundamental way. Each word landed like a stone. Eliza closed her good eye. She wanted to scream at them. Wanted to tell them she'd done nothing except fail to love a monster convincingly enough. Wanted to explain that Silas Crow's idea of marriage involved fists and whiskey and expectations she couldn't have met if she'd had 100 years to try. But her jaw ached too much to form words. And even if she could speak, what good would it do? Nobody wanted to hear her version. They'd already written the story in their heads. Wayward wife gets what she deserves. Tale as old as time. The sun beat down mercilessly. Hardridge sat in what maps optimistically called a valley, but was really just a depression in the high desert where nothing grew except scrub brush and disappointment. The heat radiated up from the packed earth, making Eliza's skin feel like it might crack and peel away. Her throat was desperately dry. When had she last had water? Yesterday. This morning, before Silas had started drinking. Time had gotten strange during those 3 days of marriage. It had stretched and compressed in ways that didn't make sense. Some moments, the bad ones, had lasted hours. Others had vanished entirely, her mind mercifully blanking them out. She should move. She should get up, gather her scattered things, and figure out what came next. But her body wasn't cooperating. Everything hurt. Her ribs screamed with each shallow breath. Her left arm wouldn't straighten properly. And beneath the physical pain sat something worse, a bone-deep exhaustion that felt less like tired and more like her soul had given up. Maybe she should just stay here. Close her eyes and let whatever happened next happen. It couldn't be worse than the past 3 days. It couldn't be worse than the suffocating realization that she'd made the worst mistake of her life and there was no way to unmake it. She'd been so stupid, so desperately, pathetically stupid. 6 weeks ago, Silas Crow had arrived in her hometown of Clemency like a fever dream wrapped in expensive clothes. He was handsome in a sharp-edged way, with black hair slicked back and eyes that knew how to find a woman's face in a crowd. He had money, or claimed to, and owned land out west. A ranch, cattle, prospects. Eliza had been working as a seamstress, living in a back room of the dress shop, saving every penny toward nothing in particular because there was nothing to save toward. She was 24 years old. In a place like Clemency, that made her almost an old maid. The good marriages had all happened years ago. What remained were widowers looking for free housekeepers and boys too shiftless to support a wife. Then Silas had walked into the shop one afternoon and smiled at her. "You make that dress?" he'd asked, pointing to the blue cotton she'd just finished hemming. "Yes, sir." "Fine work." His eyes traveled up from the dress to her face. "Real fine." She should have heard the danger in his voice, should have recognized the particular way his gaze stuck to her like he was assessing livestock. But she'd been so tired, tired of the tiny room, tired of sewing until her fingers bled, tired of watching other women live lives that included more than needles and thread and endless, suffocating sameness. When Silas came back the next day and the day after that, and started talking about his ranch and his future, and how a man built something real out west, she'd let herself believe. When he'd asked her father for permission to court her, she'd felt something that might have been hope. The courtship lasted 2 weeks. That should have been her first clue. No decent man married a woman after 2 weeks. But Silas had been persuasive. He had plans to return west soon. Couldn't delay. A ranch didn't run itself. They could marry quick and simple, head out to his land, and build a life together under bigger skies than Clemency had ever known. Her father had been thrilled. One less mouth to feed. One daughter successfully married off despite her advancing age. He'd practically shoved her toward the altar. The wedding was small. Afterward, Silas had gotten drunk at the celebration dinner. That should have been the second clue. But Eliza had told herself lots of men drank at their own weddings. It was nerves, excitement. It didn't mean anything. They'd left Clemency the next morning on the westbound stage. Silas had been quiet, nursing a headache. She'd been nervous, chattering to fill the silence. The other passengers, a mining company clerk and an elderly woman traveling to see her daughter, had watched them with the polite disinterest strangers showed newlyweds. The first night, they'd stopped at a way station. That's when Silas changed. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe he just stopped pretending. The tiny room they'd rented had one bed and walls thin enough to hear conversations 3 rooms over. Silas had started drinking before supper. By the time they were alone, his face had gone red and his words had gotten mean. "You've been awfully quiet today," he'd said, loosening his collar. "What, you scared now? Having second thoughts?" "No, I'm just tired from the... Don't lie to me." He'd move fast, grabbing her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You think I don't see it? You looking out that window all day like you want to jump out and run." "That's not true. I wasn't..." The first slap had shocked her more than hurt her. It wasn't the hardest hit she'd ever taken. Her father had a temper when the crops failed, but the casualness of it made her stomach drop, like swatting a fly, like she was nothing. "You listen when I talk," Silas had said. His voice was still conversational, almost friendly. That made it worse somehow. "I paid good money for you. Well, not money exactly. Your daddy owed me from a card game 3 years back. But same difference. You're mine now. You do what I say when I say it, and maybe we'll get along fine." The room had tilted. "Owed you? What are you? My father said you were a rancher." "I am a rancher," Silas grinned. It was the smile of something that had just caught prey. "Got a nice spread about 80 miles from here. Also got a saloon in Hardridge, a stake in a mine, and about 6 different ways to make money off folks too stupid to read a contract. Your daddy couldn't pay up, so I took you instead. Fair trade, I figured. Pretty enough. Young enough to give me sons. Worked out real convenient." Eliza had stared at him. Her mind had gone blank and screaming at the same time. "That's not... You can't..." "Oh, I can." He'd pulled her closer. His breath smelled like whiskey and tobacco and something rotten underneath. "You're my wife now. Law says so. Which means you're my property, same as my horse or my boots. And if my property don't work right, I fix it or throw it away. Your choice which." That was the moment Eliza understood she'd been sold. The next 2 days passed in a nightmare haze. Silas had very specific ideas about what a wife was for. When Eliza tried to resist, he'd hit her until she stopped trying. When she cried, He hit her for being weak. When she went silent, he hit her for being sullen. There was no right answer, no safe response. The rules changed constantly, and the only constant was his fists. By the third morning, when they boarded the stage to continue toward Hardridge, Eliza was covered in bruises. The other passengers, different ones this time, had noticed but said nothing. That was how it worked. Marriage made violence invisible. People looked away because looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant maybe having to do something, and doing something was complicated and uncomfortable and not their business anyway. Halfway to Hardridge, Silas had started drinking again, started muttering about how she wasn't worth the trouble, how her daddy had cheated him, how she was damaged goods, frigid and useless, and probably diseased besides. "You know what?" he'd said suddenly, his words slurring. "I don't want you anymore. You're more trouble than you're worth." He'd grabbed her hair, yanked her toward the door. She'd fought then, finally, desperately fought. But he was stronger, and the other passengers just pressed themselves against their seats, eyes forward, seeing nothing. The door had opened. Air and noise rushed in, and then she was falling, tumbling, the ground rising up to meet her face. Now here she lay in Hardridge's main street, alone except for the strangers who'd already decided she wasn't worth helping. Eliza forced her good eye open. The street was mostly empty now. A few people lingered at a distance, curious but cautious, like they were watching a snake to see if it would strike. Her scattered belongings surrounded her like the remnants of a life that had exploded. She needed to gather them, needed to move. With tremendous effort, she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her left arm buckled immediately, sending her face first back into the dirt. She tasted blood again, fresh this time, from a split lip that had just reopened. "God damn it," she whispered. Her voice came out cracked and raw. "God damn it, get up." She tried again. This time she made it to her knees. The world spun violently. Black spots danced across her vision. She stayed very still, head down, breathing through her mouth until the dizziness passed. When she looked up, she saw boots. A man stood about 10 feet away, watching her. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty work clothes that had seen better days. His hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a weathered complexion and dark hair that needed cutting. He held himself very still, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. "You need help," he said. It wasn't a question. Eliza's throat closed up. She wanted to say yes, wanted to scream, "Yes, please, help me, I'm dying here." But the words wouldn't come. Silas had spent 3 days teaching her that asking for help meant showing weakness, and weakness got punished. The man shifted his weight. "I'm not going to hurt you." His voice was quiet, careful. "I'm just asking if you need help." Eliza's voice cracked. She swallowed, tried again. "I'm fine." Even she didn't believe it. She was on her knees in the street, beaten half to death, with her worldly possessions scattered around her like garbage. Fine was a country she couldn't even see from here. The man didn't move. "My name's Rowan Hale. I got a ranch about an hour's ride from town. I come in for supplies and saw what happened." He paused. "Saw the whole town decide you weren't worth helping." Shame burned through Eliza's chest, hot and choking. She tried to stand, got one foot planted, and collapsed sideways. This time, she didn't even try to catch herself. She just lay there, curled on her side, and wished the earth would open up and swallow her whole. Footsteps approached. She tensed, waiting for a kick or worse, but Rowan Hale just knelt down a few feet away, close enough to help, far enough to give her space. "Listen," he said, "I don't know what you did or didn't do. Don't much care if I'm honest. What I do know is nobody deserves to be thrown away like trash, and nobody deserves to lie in the street while a whole town pretends they're invisible." He was quiet for a moment. "You're coming with me." Eliza's mind stuttered. Coming with him, going somewhere, anywhere. The thought was terrifying and tempting in equal measure. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Rowan said it like it was simple, like morality was something straightforward instead of the twisted, weaponized thing Eliza had learned it to be. "And because I need help on the ranch. You can work for wages, room and board, honest pay for honest work, nothing more." "I can't," Eliza's voice broke. "I can't pay you back. I don't have anything." "Don't want you to pay me back." Rowan stood slowly, giving her time to track his movement. "Want you to work, if you're willing. If not, I'll take you to the boarding house and pay for a week's room. Your choice." "Your choice?" When was the last time someone had given her a choice? Eliza lay there, tasting blood and dirt, feeling the sun bake her bruised skin. She could go to the boarding house, hide in a room until the bruises faded. Then what? She had no money, no prospects, no way to get home even if she wanted to, which she didn't, because going home meant admitting failure to a father who'd literally sold her to settle a gambling debt. Or she could trust this stranger, this man who'd watched her get thrown into the street, and decided, for reasons she couldn't understand, that she mattered. It was possibly the stupidest decision she'd ever made, and she'd made some spectacularly stupid decisions lately. "Okay," she whispered. Rowan nodded once, sharp and sure. "Can you stand?" "Don't know." "Let's find out." He moved closer, slowly telegraphing every motion. When he reached for her arm, she flinched hard enough to make her ribs scream. He froze. "Just going to help you up," he said. "That's all." Eliza forced herself to stay still as his hand closed around her forearm. His grip was firm but careful, like he was holding something fragile. With his support, she managed to get her feet under her. Standing made her head swim and her vision tunnel down to a pinpoint, but she stayed upright through sheer, stubborn will. "Good," Rowan said. "That's real good. Now let's get your things." He released her arm, giving her space again, and started gathering her scattered belongings. He picked up the burst carpet bag, shook the dust off it, and began methodically collecting her possessions. The dresses, carefully folded, the hairbrush, examined for damage, the tin of needles closed with a soft click. Eliza watched him handle her things with a strange gentleness that made her chest ache. Nobody had been gentle with her in so long she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. "This everything?" Rowan asked, straightening up with her repacked bag. She nodded. It was everything. Everything she owned fit in one small carpet bag, and half of it was broken. "All right then." Rowan tilted his head toward the far end of the street. "Wagon's this way. You think you can walk, or you need me to carry you?" "I can walk." Pride made her say it. Stubbornness made her mean it. She'd been carried enough, carried to a wedding she didn't understand, carried into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She'd walk out of this town on her own 2 feet, or die trying. They made their way down the street slowly. Each step sent pain lancing through Eliza's body. Her left leg didn't want to bear weight properly. Something was wrong with her ribs. They ground together when she breathed, but she kept moving, kept her eyes forward, acutely aware of the faces watching from windows and doorways, judging her, still judging her. "Let them," she thought viciously. "Let them think whatever they want. I'm leaving." Rowan's wagon waited at the edge of town, a sturdy flatbed with a tired-looking horse hitched to the front. Supplies were already loaded in the back. Sacks of flour and beans, coils of rope, a few tools wrapped in canvas. Rowan set her carpet bag down carefully among the supplies, then turned to help her up. Getting into the wagon was a fresh kind of hell. Eliza's body screamed in protest as she tried to climb. Her arms shook. Her leg refused to lift high enough to reach the footboard. After 3 failed attempts, she stopped, breathing hard, sweat running down her face despite the pain it caused when the salt hit her split lip. "I can't," she admitted. The words tasted like ash. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Sure you can." Rowan's voice was matter of fact. "Just needs a different approach. You mind if I lift you?" Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, but her body had reached its limit. She couldn't climb, couldn't run, could barely stand. If she wanted out of Hardridge, she needed help. "Okay," she breathed. Rowan moved behind her, slow and deliberate. His hand settled on her waist. Not grabbing, just supporting. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. He lifted her as easily as picking up a child, careful not to jostle her too much, and set her gently on the wagon seat. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds, but Eliza spent them rigid with fear, waiting for the trap to spring. It didn't. Rowan just stepped back, dusted off his hands, and walked around to the driver's side. "You good?" he asked, settling onto the seat beside her. Eliza nodded. She wasn't good. She was the opposite of good. But she was off the ground and out of Hardridge's judging sight, and that was something. Rowan picked up the reins. "It's about an hour to the ranch. Road's not great. You need me to stop. You say so." "I'll be fine." He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. "You keep saying that. Doesn't make it true." Before she could respond, he clicked his tongue and snapped the reins. The horse started forward, pulling the wagon into motion. They rolled through Hardridge's outskirts and onto the open road beyond. Within minutes, the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by heat, shimmer, and dust. Eliza sat very still, hands clenched in her lap, trying not to think about what she'd just done. She'd left with a complete stranger. She had no idea where his ranch was. No idea if he was telling the truth about honest work and fair pay. No idea if she'd just traded one nightmare for another. But what choice did she have? Stay in Hardridge and starve? Beg strangers for mercy? Go crawling back to Clemency and her father's house? No. This was her choice. Maybe a stupid choice, maybe a doomed choice, but hers. That had to count for something. They rode in silence for a while. The road cut through empty scrubland dotted with twisted juniper and sage. Mountains rose in the distance, purple blue against the harsh sky. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. Eliza had never been this far west before. Everything felt bigger here, emptier, like there was room for things to happen that couldn't happen in cramped little towns where everyone knew everyone's business. "So," Rowan said eventually. His voice was casual, but Eliza heard the carefulness underneath. "You got people looking for you?" Her stomach clenched. Silas. He'd thrown her away, but that didn't mean he was done with her. Men like him didn't like losing their property, even property they'd decided was worthless. "Maybe," she admitted. "The man who threw you out. Your husband?" Eliza's throat tightened. "For 3 more days, legally." She didn't elaborate. Couldn't. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. "He likely to come to my ranch looking for you?" "I don't know." It was the truth. She had no idea what Silas would do. Maybe he'd forget about her completely, move on to the next woman stupid enough to believe his lies. Or maybe his pride would demand he find her, punish her for the sin of being thrown away instead of leaving voluntarily. "All right," Rowan nodded slowly. "If he shows up, we'll deal with it." "We?" The word escaped before Eliza could stop it. "You're working for me now. That makes you my responsibility." He said it like it was obvious, like responsibility was something that came with employment instead of something to be avoided at all costs. "Nobody's going to hurt you on my land, not if I can help it." Eliza stared at him. This man, this stranger, was making promises he might not be able to keep. Promises that could get him hurt or worse. And he was doing it for her. For someone he'd watched get thrown into the street like garbage. Why? The question came out raw and desperate. "Why are you doing this?" Rowan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "I had a sister once, Ellen. She married a man who seemed decent enough. Couple years later she was dead. Fell down the stairs, they said. Broke her neck." His jaw tightened. "She didn't fall. Everyone knew she didn't fall. But her husband had money and connections, and she was just a woman who'd gotten clumsy." The pain in his voice was old and deep. Eliza recognized it, the specific ache of watching someone you love get hurt and being powerless to stop it. "I couldn't help Ellen," Rowan continued. "I was working a ranch 3 territories over when it happened. By the time I got word and made it back, she'd been in the ground 2 months and her husband had already remarried." He looked at Eliza directly for the first time. "So when I saw you in that street, saw everyone walking away like you were invisible, I figured maybe I could help you instead. Maybe that evens some cosmic scales. Maybe it doesn't. But I had to try." Eliza's eyes burned. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried. Sometime during the 3-day nightmare with Silas, probably, but now tears threatened to spill over. Not from sadness, from something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said quietly. "Me too." Rowan turned back to the road. "She would have liked you, I think. She was stubborn as hell, kept getting back up no matter how many times life knocked her down." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You remind me of her, the way you made yourself stand in that street even though everything hurt." They fell silent again after that. Eliza watched the landscape roll past, trying not to think about the pain radiating through her body with every bump in the road, trying not to think about Silas or her father or the chain of terrible decisions that had led her here. Instead, she thought about Ellen, a woman she'd never met, a woman who died alone in a house that should have been safe, a woman whose brother still carried her memory like a wound that wouldn't heal. Maybe that's what this was about. Not charity or pity, but grief. Rowan was trying to save someone because he couldn't save Ellen. It didn't make Eliza feel used exactly. More like she'd accidentally become part of something larger than herself. Like maybe her life mattered not just for her own sake, but because it represented all the other lives that had been thrown away. It was a heavy thought, but somehow, sitting in this wagon next to this quiet man with his old grief and his stubborn sense of right and wrong, it didn't feel crushing. It felt possible. The ranch appeared gradually. First just a dark smudge on the horizon, then slowly resolving into structures. A house, a barn, corrals, a windmill turning lazily in the afternoon breeze. It was small, clearly a one-man operation, but well-maintained. The fences were straight. The buildings looked solid. Even the dirt yard was neat, cleared of debris. Rowan pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. This is it. Not much, but it's home. Eliza stared at the small ranch house. It was simple. Wood siding weathered gray by sun and wind, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, windows that could use washing. But there were flowers planted along the foundation. Actual flowers, bright spots of color in this dusty landscape. And the front door had been painted a cheerful blue that was only a little faded. Someone had cared about this place. Someone had tried to make it more than just functional. "It's nice," Eliza said. She meant it. "Ellen planted those flowers," Rowan said, nodding toward the foundation. "I keep them going. Feels wrong to let them die." He climbed down from the wagon, then came around to help her. "Let's get you inside. You need water and rest and probably a doctor, though the nearest one's back in Hardridge, and I'm guessing you don't want to go back there." "No." The word came out sharp and immediate. Going back to Hardridge meant facing all those judging eyes again. Meant risking that Silas would hear she was there. "No doctor." "All right, no doctor." Rowan lifted her down from the wagon with the same careful ease as before. "But you're gonna let me look at those injuries. I've patched up enough horses and cattle to know when something's broken versus just bruised." Eliza wanted to argue, but her body chose that moment to remind her exactly how much everything hurt. The world tilted sideways, her knees buckled. Rowan caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy, I got you." He did have her, literally, at the moment, one arm around her waist supporting most of her weight, but maybe in a larger sense, too. Maybe she'd stumbled into something that resembled actual luck. Or maybe she was delirious from pain and dehydration, and this was all about to go horrifically wrong. Either way, she was too tired to care. Let whatever happened next happen. She'd survived the last 3 days. Surely she could survive one more. Rowan half-carried her up the porch steps and through the blue door. The interior of the house was dim and blessedly cool after the brutal afternoon sun. Eliza got a confused impression of simple furniture, clean floors, more flowers in a jar on a table, before Rowan guided her to a bedroom. "This was Ellen's room," he said, easing her onto the bed. "I haven't changed much, seemed wrong to." He straightened up, looking uncomfortable. "It's yours now, for as long as you need it." Eliza sank into the mattress. It was soft. Actually soft. Not the lumpy, suspicious straw mattresses she'd known her whole life. Clean sheets, a real pillow, a window with actual glass and curtains someone had sewn by hand. "I'll get water," Rowan said. "And bandages. You just stay there. Don't move." He disappeared before she could respond. Eliza lay very still, staring at the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of lavender. There was a dresser against one wall, a small mirror above it, a rocking chair by the window. A woman's room. Ellen's room. Had Ellen laid in this bed after her husband hurt her? Had she stared at this same ceiling and wondered how her life had gone so wrong? Had she ever had the chance to escape, or had the violence escalated too fast for her to run? The questions hurt almost as much as Eliza's injuries. Rowan returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and strips of linen for bandages. He set them on the dresser, then pulled the rocking chair closer to the bed and sat down heavily. "This is gonna hurt," he warned. "I'll be as gentle as I can, but there's no way around it." Eliza nodded. "I'm used to hurt." Something flashed across Rowan's face. Anger, maybe, or sorrow. But he just dampened a cloth and began cleaning the blood from her face with careful, methodical strokes. It did hurt. Every touch, however gentle, woke fresh pain. But there was something different about this hurt. It was the pain of healing, not harming. the pain of someone trying to make things better instead of worse. Rowan worked in silence, his face set in concentration. He washed away the blood and dirt, revealing the full extent of the damage. His jaw tightened when he saw the bruises on her throat, clear fingerprints where Silas had choked her. But he didn't comment, just kept working. "Gonna need to check your ribs," he said eventually. "Make sure nothing's broken." Eliza's whole body tensed. Having him touch her face was one thing. Having him touch her anywhere else triggered every alarm Silas had installed in her nervous system over 3 days of horror. Rowan saw her freeze. "I'll talk you through it. Every step. You say stop, I stop immediately. Understood?" She managed a tight nod. "Okay, I'm gonna put my hands here." He indicated the sides of her rib cage over her dress, just pressing gentle to feel if anything's moving wrong. "You tell me what hurts and how much." He did exactly what he said. His touch was clinical, careful, and lasted only as long as necessary. He pressed gently along her ribs, watching her face for reactions. She hissed when he hit a particularly tender spot on her left side. "That one's cracked, probably," he said. "Maybe 2. Nothing I can do about it except wrap you tight to keep them stable while they heal. You'll need to take it easy for a few weeks." "Can't afford to take it easy," Eliza said. "You said honest work for honest pay. I need to earn my keep, and you will. Once you're healed enough to work without breaking yourself worse." Rowan started wrapping her ribs with the linen strips, his movements efficient and impersonal. "I've managed the ranch alone this long. Few more weeks won't kill me." The binding was tight but not painful. It actually helped, made breathing easier, gave her battered ribs something to lean on. When Rowan finished, Eliza felt more stable than she had since Silas had thrown her from the stagecoach. "Your arm now." Rowan gently lifted her left arm, feeling along the bones. She whimpered when he reached her elbow. "Sprained, not broken. That's good. We'll make a sling. Keep it immobile for a week or so." He fashioned a sling from more linen, settled her arm into it with care. Each injury he addressed, Eliza felt a little more like a person and less like a collection of broken parts. "Anything else I should know about?" Rowan asked. "Places hurt, you're not telling me." Everything hurt, but most of it was bruises and cuts, painful but not dangerous. "No, that's the worst of it." He nodded. "All right, I'm going to get you more water and some food. You need to drink and eat, even if you don't feel like it. Dehydration will kill you faster than anything else out here." He stood to leave, but Eliza's voice stopped him. "Why are you being kind to me?" Rowan turned back. In the dim light of Ellen's room, his face was hard to read. "Told you already. Because it's right." "That's not a good enough reason. People don't do right just because it's right." "Maybe they should." He studied her for a long moment. "You really think you don't deserve basic human decency? That what he taught you in 3 days?" The question landed like a punch. Eliza's throat closed up. Because yes, that was exactly what Silas had taught her, that she was worthless, that kindness was a trap, that anyone offering help wanted something in return. "I don't know what I think anymore," she admitted. "Fair enough." Rowan headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you know. It takes real strength to get back up after what you've been through. Real strength to trust a stranger when every instinct's screaming not to." He met her eyes. "You made it this far. That counts for something." He left before she could respond. Eliza lay alone in Ellen's room, wrapped in bandages and borrowed safety, trying to process what had just happened. She'd been thrown away, discarded, left to die or disappear. But she hadn't died, hadn't disappeared. She was here, breathing, hurting, yes, but alive. And for the first time in 3 days, maybe longer, she felt something that wasn't fear or pain or despair. She felt like maybe, possibly, she might survive this after all. The first week passed in a fog of pain and uneasy rest. Eliza slept more than she'd thought possible, her body demanding time to heal from injuries that went deeper than bruises. When she was awake, she lay in Ellen's bed and watched light move across the walls, marking hours she had no use for. Rowan brought her meals 3 times a day. Simple food, nothing fancy, but more than she'd eaten in months. Beans and cornbread, soup with actual meat in it, coffee that didn't taste like dirt. He never lingered. He'd knock, wait for her response, set the tray on the dresser, and leave. Sometimes he'd check her bandages, rewrap her ribs when the binding loosened. His hand stayed clinical and careful. He talked to her the way he might talk to a spooked horse, quiet, steady, giving her space to settle. On the 8th day, Eliza woke before dawn and decided she was done lying in bed like an invalid. Her body protested immediately. Everything still hurt, a constant ache that sharpened into something meaner when she moved wrong. But the worst of it had dulled from unbearable to merely miserable. Her ribs ground together less when she breathed. Her arm felt stronger in its sling. The swelling around her eye had gone down enough that she could see clearly. She sat up slowly, testing her limits. Her head spun but didn't explode. Good enough. Getting dressed was an ordeal. Her traveling dress was ruined, stained with blood and dirt, torn in 3 places. But she found other clothes folded in Ellen's dresser. Simple work dresses, worn soft from washing. They were a little big on her, but she managed to pull one on despite the sling. Buttons were impossible one-handed, so she left them undone and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders to hide the gap. The mirror above the dresser showed her what she'd avoided looking at for days. Her face was a mess of healing bruises, purple fading to yellow-green, especially dark around her left eye and jaw. Her lip was still split but scabbing over. She looked like she'd been in a war. Maybe she had been. She found Rowan in the kitchen, standing at the stove and frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway, surprise flashing across his face before he caught it. "You're up," he said. "I'm up." Eliza leaned against the doorframe, already tired from the simple act of walking from the bedroom. Figured it was time. Rowan studied her for a long moment, then nodded and turned back to the eggs. "Hungry?" "Starving." He cracked 2 more eggs into the pan. They cooked in silence, not uncomfortable, just quiet. Outside, birds were starting their morning racket. Dawn light slanted through the kitchen window, turning everything gold and soft. When the eggs were done, Rowan divided them onto 2 tin plates, added some fried potatoes and bacon, and carried both to the small table. He pulled out a chair for her. Eliza sat carefully, every movement calculated to minimize the grinding in her ribs. The food was hot and greasy and tasted better than anything she could remember eating. She tried to pace herself, but hunger took over and she cleaned her plate in minutes. When she looked up, Rowan was watching her with something that might have been approval. "More?" he offered. Wasn't asking if you should, asked if you wanted more. She did want more. Her stomach felt empty despite what she'd just eaten, like it was trying to make up for weeks of not getting enough. "Yes, please." He brought her seconds without comment. While she ate, he sipped his coffee and stared out the window at the emerging morning. "So," he said eventually, "what's your plan?" Eliza paused mid-bite. "My plan? You're healing up, getting stronger. At some point, you'll need to decide what comes next." His tone was neutral, but she heard the question underneath. "How long are you staying? What do you want from this?" "I meant what I said," Eliza said carefully, "about working. Earning my keep. I'm not looking for charity." "Didn't think you were." Rowan refilled his coffee from the pot on the stove. "But ranch work's hard, physical. You sure you're up for it?" Every instinct screamed at her to say yes, to prove she wasn't weak or useless. But Silas had taught her, accidentally through brutality, that bravado without capability just got you hurt worse. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never done ranch work. I was a seamstress before." She trailed off, not wanting to finish that sentence. "Before you got married to a monster," Rowan finished flatly. Eliza flinched. "I was going to say before I made a terrible mistake. Same thing." He set his cup down with a soft clink. "Look, I'm not trying to run you off, but I need to know what you can actually do. Can you ride a horse?" "No." "Handle cattle?" "No." "Fix a fence? Mend tack? Operate a plow?" "No." Each answer felt like a failure stacking on top of the others. "I can sew, cook. If the recipe's simple. Clean. I'm good with numbers. I kept the books for the dress shop back home." Rowan considered this. Sewing's actually useful. I've got about a year's worth of torn shirts and pants piled up that need mending, and I can't cook worth a damn. Everything ends up either burned or raw. Books would help too. I'm terrible at tracking expenses. Relief flooded through Eliza. She had value. She could contribute something. "I can do all that." "Then that's what you'll do." Rowan stood and carried his empty plate to the wash basin. To start, anyway, once you're steadier on your feet, I'll teach you the rest. Can't run a ranch if you don't know how a ranch works. You'd teach me? The idea seemed absurd. Why would he invest time in teaching her skills she might never use? Why wouldn't I? Rowan looked genuinely puzzled by her surprise. You're working here. You should know how things operate. Makes you more useful and gives you options if you decide to leave. Options. That word again. He kept giving her choices, kept treating her like someone whose decisions mattered. It was disorienting. I should get started then, Eliza said, standing carefully. With the mending, I mean. If you show me where things are. You sure? You just got out of bed for the first time in over a week. I'm sure. She needed to work. Needed to prove to herself that she was more than just a collection of injuries. Sitting around makes me feel useless. Rowan looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him. All right, mending supplies are in the barn, in Ellen's old sewing box. I'll show you. The walk to the barn tested Eliza's limits. It wasn't far, maybe 50 yards from the house, but by the time they reached it, she was breathing hard and sweating despite the morning coolness. Rowan pretended not to notice, just pushed open the barn doors and let her inside. The barn smelled like hay and leather and animals. It was dim and dusty, with shafts of light cutting through gaps in the walls. A few chickens scattered as they entered. In the far corner, a cow chewed its cud and watched them with placid disinterest. Rowan climbed a ladder to the loft and came back down carrying a wooden box. He set it on a workbench and opened it. Inside was a treasure trove of sewing supplies, needles in various sizes, spools of thread in different colors, scissors, measuring tape, a pincushion shaped like a tomato. Ellen was particular about her sewing, Rowan said quietly. Everything has its place. I kept it that way. Eliza ran her fingers over the organized contents. Someone had loved this box, had taken pride in keeping it neat and functional. Thank you for letting me use it. She'd want it used. She hated waste. He pulled a burlap sack from under the workbench and dumped out a pile of clothes. Shirts with torn seams, pants with ripped knees, a coat with buttons missing. This is about half of it. There's more in the house. Eliza surveyed the damage. None of it was beyond repair, just neglected. She could fix this. She knew exactly how to fix this. I can have most of it done in a few days. Take your time. I've survived this long with torn shirts. Rowan headed for the barn doors. I'll be working the far pasture today, checking fence lines. You need anything? Just yell. He left her there in the quiet barn with Ellen's sewing box and a mountain of mending. Eliza settled onto a stool by the workbench, positioned the first shirt in her lap, and began threading a needle. The work was soothing, familiar. Her hands knew what to do even if her body still ached. She fell into the rhythm of it. Thread through fabric, pull tight, repeat. The torn seam gradually closed, neat stitches marching along the damage until it disappeared. Hours passed. The light shifted. The cow eventually lay down and went to sleep. Eliza worked steadily, pausing only when her ribs screamed too loud or her arm protested being held in one position too long. By the time Rowan returned at midday, she'd finished 3 shirts and was starting on a 4th. You should take a break, he said, appearing in the barn doorway with dust on his clothes and sweat on his face. I'm fine. Eliza. His voice held a note of warning. You just spent 4 hours hunched over a needle. Your body needs rest. She wanted to argue, but her back was cramping and her good hand was starting to shake from strain. Maybe a short break. That's what I thought. He gestured toward the house. Come on, I'll make lunch. Lunch turned out to be cold meat and bread, which Rowan assembled with the confidence of someone who'd been making the same meal for years. They ate on the porch, where a breeze cut the afternoon heat. You're fast, Rowan commented, nodding toward the barn. With the sewing. I did it for a living. Speed mattered. Eliza tore off a piece of bread. The shop owner paid by the piece, not the hour. You learned to work fast or you didn't eat. Sounds like a hard way to live. It was. She hadn't meant to say that out loud, but exhaustion was loosening her tongue. But it was mine. I had my own room, my own money. Nobody could... She stopped, realizing where that sentence was going. Nobody could hit you, she'd almost said. Nobody could force you. Nobody owned you. Rowan didn't push, just ate his bread and watched a hawk circle lazily overhead. Can I ask you something? Eliza said after a while. Sure. Why'd you stay out here? After Ellen died. Most people would have left. Too many bad memories. Rowan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. I thought about it. Thought about selling the place, moving on. But this was Ellen's dream. She picked this land. She planted those flowers. She made this feel like home instead of just a place to sleep. He paused. Leaving felt like abandoning her. Again. The guilt in his voice was thick enough to choke on. Eliza recognized it. The weight of things you couldn't fix, mistakes you couldn't unmake. You didn't abandon her, she said quietly. You were working. You couldn't have known. Doesn't matter. I should have known. Should have seen the signs. His jaw tightened. She wrote me letters. I kept them all. When I went back and read them after she died, the signs were there. Little things. The way she'd mentioned being clumsy, always tripping and falling, how she'd apologize for boring me with domestic troubles, how she'd say her husband was just stressed, just having a hard time adjusting to married life. Eliza's stomach turned. She'd written those same kinds of letters to her friend back in Clemency during her brief marriage to Silas. Minimizing, explaining away, making excuses for inexcusable things. You couldn't have saved her, she said. Even if you'd come back, even if you'd known, he would have found a way. Men like that always do. Maybe, Rowan stood abruptly, gathering the lunch dishes. Or maybe I could have given her a choice, a place to run. Something. He disappeared into the house before she could respond. Eliza sat alone on the porch, thinking about Ellen. A woman who'd loved this land, who'd planted flowers in harsh soil and tried to build something beautiful, who'd written careful letters that hid the truth because the truth was too ugly to speak out loud. She wondered if Ellen had ever had a moment like hers in that Hardridge street, a moment where someone offered help. If anyone had ever looked at her bruises and said something matters here, probably not. That's why Rowan carried so much guilt, because nobody had helped Ellen, nobody had seen. And by the time Rowan realized what was happening, it was too late. But it wasn't too late for Eliza. She was here, she was alive, and she was going to make damn sure she stayed that way. The next few weeks established a rhythm. Eliza mended clothes, cooked meals, and kept the house in order. She worked within her limits but pushed them gradually, testing how much her body could handle. Each day she felt a little stronger. The bruises faded from purple to yellow to gone. Her ribs stopped grinding and started just aching dully. She graduated from a sling to careful use of her left arm. Rowan taught her ranch work in small increments. How to feed the chickens without getting pecked. How to milk the cow without getting kicked. How to recognize when the horse needed new shoes. He was patient and thorough, never making her feel stupid for not knowing things he considered basic. One afternoon, 3 weeks after her arrival, Rowan announced they were going to Hardridge for supplies. Eliza's stomach dropped. I can't go back there. You can and you will. His voice was firm but not unkind. You can't hide on this ranch forever. At some point you need to face that town again. They'll talk. They'll judge. Let them. Rowan was checking the wagon harness, testing straps for wear. Their opinions don't change who you are or what happened. You didn't do anything wrong. Walking through town with your head up proves that. What if Silas is there? That made Rowan pause. He turned to look at her directly. Is that what you're really scared of? Or is it what everyone thinks? Both, Eliza wanted to say. I'm scared of everything. But she'd been working on not showing fear, so she lifted her chin and said, if Silas is there, what do we do? We handle it. Rowan's hand moved unconsciously to his hip, where she knew he kept a knife. But odds are he's not. Man like that moves on quick, finds new victims, forgets about the old ones. The casual way he said it, new victims, made Eliza's skin crawl. Because he was right. Silas wasn't unique. There were men like him everywhere, and they'd keep hurting women until something stopped them. All right, she said, I'll go. The ride to Hardridge felt both longer and shorter than she remembered. Eliza spent it trying not to panic, hands clenched in her lap so tight her knuckles went white. Rowan didn't try to make conversation, just drove steadily, occasionally pointing out landmarks. That rock formation means we're halfway. That stand of trees marks the Morrison property line. When Hardridge appeared on the horizon, Eliza's heart started hammering against her still tender ribs. She could see the main street from here, the same street where she'd been thrown like garbage. Breathe, Rowan said quietly. You're holding your breath. She forced herself to inhale, exhale. Keep breathing like a normal person instead of someone on the edge of bolting. They rolled into town just before noon. The main street was busy, people loading wagons, women with shopping baskets, children running between buildings. Normal life happening all around them. Rowan pulled the wagon up to the general store and set the brake. I'll get the supplies. You want to wait here or come in? Every fiber of Eliza's being wanted to wait in the wagon, hide, make herself small and invisible. But Rowan's words echoed in her head. You can't hide forever. I'll come in, she said. Her voice only shook a little. The general store was dim and crowded with merchandise. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with everything from canned goods to farming equipment. A few other customers browsed quietly. Behind the counter, a thin man with spectacles looked up as they entered. His gaze landed on Eliza, and recognition flashed across his face. She saw him remember. Saw him place her as the woman who'd been thrown into the street. Mr. Hale, the shopkeeper said carefully. What can I do for you today? Need flour, sugar, coffee, Rowan said, pulling out a list. Salt, beans, some ammunition, few other things. Of course, I'll get that together. The shopkeeper kept sneaking glances at Eliza while he gathered items. She stood very still, chin up, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. A woman entered the store, middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying a basket. She froze when she saw Eliza. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened slightly like she was about to say something. Then she pressed her lips together and hurried toward the fabric section, putting distance between them. The message was clear. You're not welcome here. Eliza's hands started shaking. She shoved them into the pockets of her dress before anyone could see. Eliza! She turned. A woman stood a few feet away, young, maybe 19 or 20, with tired eyes and a baby on her hip. She looked familiar, though Eliza couldn't place her. I'm sorry, the woman said quietly, for what happened, for everyone just watching. Eliza stared at her. An apology. She hadn't expected that. I wanted to help, the woman continued, shifting the baby higher. But my husband said to stay out of it, said it wasn't our business. Her eyes were shiny with unshed tears. I should have helped anyway. I'm sorry I didn't. Eliza's throat tightened. It's okay. You're here now. That's something. The woman nodded, wiped her eyes quickly, and hurried out of the store before anyone else could see her talking to the disgraced wife. But she'd talked. She'd apologized. One person in this entire town had looked at Eliza and seen a person worth acknowledging. It was a small thing, but it loosened something in Eliza's chest that had been locked tight since she'd hit the dirt that first day. Rowan finished paying for the supplies. The shopkeeper handed over the parcels without comment, though his expression remained carefully neutral. They loaded everything into the wagon in silence. As Rowan climbed into the driver's seat, a man's voice called out, Hail! Eliza's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Silas Crow walked toward them from across the street, a bottle in one hand and fury on his face. He'd lost weight since she'd seen him last, looked thinner and meaner, like hunger had pared him down to nothing but rage and bones. That's my wife you got there, Silas said, pointing at Eliza with his bottle. You got no right keeping her. Rowan didn't move, just sat there holding the reins, expression flat. She's not your property, never was. The hell she's not. We're married legal. That makes her mine. Silas took a step closer. He reeked of whiskey even from 10 feet away. I paid for her fair and square. You paid off a gambling debt with a human being, Rowan said evenly. That's not a marriage, that's slavery. People were stopping to watch now. The crowd that had ignored Eliza's suffering 3 weeks ago was suddenly very interested in this confrontation. Silas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. You gonna tell me about law, Hale? I know law. Law says a wife belongs to her husband. Says I got rights to her. You're harboring stolen property. I'm harboring a woman who escaped abuse. Rowan's voice stayed calm, but Eliza could see tension in his shoulders. Big difference. Abuse. Silas spat the word. I disciplined a disobedient wife. That's my right as a husband. She needed teaching and I taught her. His eyes found Eliza. Get down here, now. Eliza's body wanted to obey. 3 days of conditioning screamed at her to comply before he got violent, but she forced herself to stay in the wagon seat, forced her voice to work. No. Silas's face went dark red. What did you say? I said no. Her voice was shaking but audible. I'm not going with you. I'm not your wife. I'm not your property. I'm done. For a second, Silas just stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Then he lunged toward the wagon. Rowan was faster. He jumped down and put himself between Silas and Eliza, one hand on the knife at his belt. That's far enough. Get out of my way, Silas snarled. This is between me and my wife. She's not your wife. Marriage requires consent. What you had was ownership. Rowan's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. And you're not taking her anywhere? Silas sized Rowan up, calculating odds, weighing whether he could win a fight. Around them, the crowd watched in breathless silence. Then a new voice cut through the tension. There a problem here? A man wearing a sheriff's badge pushed through the crowd. He was older, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades keeping order in a place that didn't want to be kept. Sheriff Hammond, Silas said, suddenly reasonable. Perfect timing. This man's harboring my wife. I need you to order him to return my property. Sheriff Hammond looked from Silas to Rowan to Eliza. His expression was unreadable. That true, Hale? She your wife, Crow? We were married, Eliza said, before either man could answer. She made herself speak clearly, loudly enough for the crowd to hear. For 3 days, during which he beat me, choked me, and told me he'd bought me to settle a gambling debt with my father. Then he threw me from a moving stagecoach and told me to stay gone. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Silas's face went redder. That's a lie, he said. She's hysterical, irrational. That's why I had to discipline her. Half the town saw you throw her, Sheriff Hammond interrupted. I saw the aftermath myself. Woman couldn't stand, she was so busted up. He turned to Eliza. You want to press charges against this man? The question hung in the air like smoke. Charges. Making this official. Making this a legal battle instead of just a personal nightmare. Can I do that? Eliza asked. Press charges against my husband? Technically, he's your husband in name only, Sheriff Hammond said carefully. Marriage requires consummation. He assaulted you before that happened, from what I understand, which means the marriage could be annulled on grounds of non-consummation and violence, and assault charges could be filed separately. Hope and terror warred in Eliza's chest. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I want to press charges. Silas exploded. You can't do that. She's my wife. She's lying. Shut up, Crow. Sheriff Hammond's voice cracked like a whip. I've had complaints about you before. Bar fights, cheating at cards, roughing up working girls who couldn't complain. You've been getting away with it because nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork. He looked at Eliza. But if she's willing to testify, that changes things. This is bullshit, Silas snarled. He lunged at the wagon again, not at Eliza this time, but at Rowan. This is your fault, you interfering. He didn't finish. Rowan's fist caught him square in the jaw, snapping his head back. Silas dropped like a sack of grain, hitting the dirt hard. The crowd gasped. Rowan stood over Silas's prone body, rubbing his knuckles. He assaulted me first. You all saw that. Multiple heads nodded. Even the people who'd ignored Eliza's suffering seemed willing to confirm that Silas had swung first. Sheriff Hammond sighed heavily. Crow, you're under arrest for assault and battery, and we'll be having a longer conversation about those other complaints. He pulled out handcuffs. Anyone objects? Speak now. Nobody objected. The crowd just watched as Sheriff Hammond cuffed the still-dazed Silas and hauled him to his feet. Miss Boone, the sheriff said, tipping his hat to Eliza. You'll need to come by my office tomorrow to make a formal statement. Bring any evidence you got. Witnesses, physical marks, anything that backs up your story. I will, Eliza managed. Her whole body was shaking now that the confrontation was over. Good. Sheriff Hammond dragged Silas toward the jail at the end of the street. The crowd parted for them, whispering excitedly. Rowan climbed back into the wagon and picked up the reins. You did good, he said quietly. Eliza couldn't respond, couldn't process what had just happened. She'd stood up to Silas, she'd pressed charges, she'd started a process that might actually end this nightmare for real, or it might make everything worse. Silas had connections, money, he could afford lawyers. She had nothing but bruises and the testimony of one man who'd taken pity on her. As they drove out of Hardridge, Eliza looked back at the town. People were still clustered in groups, talking animatedly. The story would spread. By nightfall, everyone within 20 miles would know about the woman who dared to charge her husband with assault. Some would call her brave. Most would call her something else. But for the first time since that stagecoach door had opened and dumped her into the dirt, Eliza felt like maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. The statement took 4 hours to write. Eliza sat in Sheriff Hammond's cramped office the next morning, her hand cramping around a pen as she documented every moment of her 3-day marriage, every blow, every threat, every humiliation Silas had inflicted. The words came slowly at first, then faster as something broke loose inside her, a dam that had been holding back truth. She'd been too ashamed to speak. Sheriff Hammond sat across from her, reading over her shoulder, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "This is bad," he said finally. "Worse than I thought. You sure you want to do this? Crow's gonna fight. He's got money and friends in this town. I'm sure." Eliza's hand still shook from writing, but her voice came out steady. "If I don't do this, he'll just do it to someone else. Probably already has." Hammond pulled out a folder, flipped it open. "I did some checking after yesterday. Turns out Crow's been married before, twice. First wife disappeared, just up and vanished one night, according to him. Second wife died in a fall. Both cases got ruled accidental or unexplained. Nobody pushed too hard because Crow had money and connections." Eliza's stomach turned. "He's killed before. Can't prove it. But yeah, I'd bet money on it." Hammond closed the folder. "Which is why your testimony matters. It's the first time anyone's been willing to stand up and say what he is. When's the trial?" "Judge comes through in 3 weeks. I'll hold Crow until then. Can't risk him running or coming after you." He paused. "You should know, though, his lawyer's already been here. Thomas Ridgway, slickest snake this side of the territory. He's going to tear into you on that stand, make you out to be a liar, a troublemaker, maybe worse." "I know." Eliza had been expecting it. Men like Silas didn't go down easy, and their lawyers knew every trick to discredit women who dared speak up. And the town— Hammond looked uncomfortable. "People are talking. Some think you're brave, others think you're causing trouble where there doesn't need to be any. It's going to get messy before it gets better." "It's already messy." Eliza stood, legs unsteady. "At least now it's messy on my terms." She left the sheriff's office and found Rowan waiting with the wagon. He didn't ask how it went, just helped her up and started driving. They were halfway home before he spoke. "You did the right thing." "Doesn't feel right. Feels terrifying." "Can be both." Rowan guided the horse around a deep rut in the road. "Doing right usually is terrifying. That's how you know it matters." Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that standing up to Silas would lead somewhere other than disaster. But 3 weeks until trial felt like an eternity, and she had no idea what would happen when she finally faced him in court. The following days brought unexpected visitors. The young woman from the general store, her name was Mary Bridger, came to the ranch with her baby and a basket of food. She stayed for an hour, talking quietly about her own marriage, her own fears. She never said her husband hit her, but Eliza heard it in the pauses between words, saw it in the way Mary flinched at sudden movements. "If you win," Mary said as she was leaving, "if you actually beat him in court, that would mean something, for all of us." 2 days later, an older woman named Catherine Wells arrived with her daughter. Catherine was a widow who ran a boarding house in Hardridge. Her daughter Anne was 17 and engaged to a man Catherine didn't trust. "I need her to see what you're doing," Catherine said bluntly, sitting at Rowan's kitchen table. "I need her to understand that marriage isn't a cage you can't escape, that if a man shows you who he is before the wedding, you're allowed to believe him." Anne sat silent and wide-eyed while Eliza told her story. When Eliza described being thrown from the stagecoach, the girl's face went pale. "Thomas, my fiancé, he gets angry sometimes," Anne admitted quietly. "Breaks things, punches walls. But he says he'd never hurt me, that it's different when it's someone you love. That's what they all say." Eliza kept her voice gentle. "And maybe Thomas is telling the truth, but maybe you should wait and see if he can control that anger before you tie yourself to him legally." Anne left, looking thoughtful. Catherine squeezed Eliza's hand on the way out. "Thank you. You might have just saved her from my mistakes." The visitors kept coming. Women Eliza had never met, from towns she'd never heard of, showed up at Rowan's door with stories that echoed her own. Some had escaped bad marriages. Others were trapped in them, looking for hope that escape was possible. A few just wanted to witness the woman who dared to press charges against her husband. Eliza talked to them all, shared her story until she could recite it without crying. And slowly, something shifted inside her. The shame that had weighed her down since Silas first hit her began to lift. These women didn't see her as damaged goods. They saw her as someone fighting back, someone who mattered. But not everyone was supportive. The same day Catherine brought Anne, a man named Douglas Finch arrived, one of Silas's friends, according to Rowan. He was drunk and belligerent, shouting from the property line about lying whores and men's rights. Rowan ran him off with a rifle and a warning that trespassing would end poorly. "They're going to keep coming," Rowan said afterward, checking the rifle's ammunition. "Crow's people. Men who think you're threatening their way of life." "Am I?" Eliza asked. "Yeah, you are." Rowan set the rifle by the door. "And that's exactly why you can't back down." The threats escalated. Someone left a dead crow nailed to the barn door with a note, "Keep your mouth shut or end up like this." Another night, rocks came through the kitchen window, scattering glass across the floor. Rowan boarded up the window and started sleeping in the main room with his rifle close. Eliza hated it, hated that her fight was putting Rowan in danger, hated that standing up for herself meant making enemies of people who should have been on her side. "You should take me back to town," she said one night after finding another threatening note shoved under the door. "Let me stay at the boarding house until the trial. I'm bringing trouble to your doorstep." "Too late. Trouble's already here." Rowan threw the note into the fire without reading it. "Besides, you think they'll stop if you leave? This isn't about where you sleep. It's about you refusing to be quiet." He was right, but it didn't make her feel less guilty. She lay awake that night listening to the sounds of the ranch, jumping at every creak and rustle. Sometime after midnight, she gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen for water. Rowan was there sitting at the table in the dark. The rifle lay across his lap. "Can't sleep either?" Eliza asked. "Not much." He gestured at the empty chair. "Sit if you want." She sat. They shared the silence for a while, listening to night insects and distant coyotes. "You don't have to do this," Eliza said finally. "Protect me, I mean. You've already done more than anyone could expect." "I know I don't have to." Rowan's voice was tired. "But I'm going to anyway. Because it's right, and because—" He trailed off. "Because of Ellen." "Yeah, because of Ellen." He was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't save her. But maybe if I help you, it balances something out, makes her death mean something." Eliza understood. She was standing in for a dead woman, carrying Ellen's fight because Ellen couldn't carry it herself anymore. It should have felt like pressure, like being used. Instead, it felt like purpose. "Tell me about her," Eliza said. "Ellen, not how she died, how she lived." Rowan's expression softened. She was fierce, had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. She could outwork any man on this ranch and never complained about it. He smiled slightly. "She had this laugh, loud and completely undignified. Our mother used to say it wasn't proper for a lady. Ellen would just laugh harder." "She sounds wonderful." She was. The smile faded. She deserved better than what she got. Deserved someone who saw her strength instead of trying to break it. They sat together until dawn started graying the windows. When Rowan finally went to catch a few hours of sleep, Eliza felt less alone than she had in weeks. She was carrying Ellen's fight, but she wasn't carrying it solo. Rowan was beside her, and slowly, a whole network of women was forming behind her. The week before the trial, Rowan taught Eliza to shoot. "You need to be able to defend yourself," he said, setting up targets behind the barn. "I can't be everywhere. And if Crow gets out somehow, if his friends come when I'm not here, you need options." The rifle was heavier than Eliza expected. She'd never held a gun before. Her father hadn't believed in women and weapons. Rowan showed her how to load it, aim it, brace for the recoil. Her first shot went wide, kicking her shoulder hard enough to bruise. The second hit dirt 10 feet left of the target. The third actually clipped the edge of the target, sending up a puff of splintered wood. "Better," Rowan said. "Again." They practiced for 2 hours. By the end, Eliza could hit the target more often than not, and her shoulder felt like one giant bruise. But she'd learned something valuable. She wasn't helpless. Given a weapon and knowledge, she could fight back. "Don't go looking for trouble," Rowan warned as they walked back to the house. "But if trouble finds you, you aim center mass and you don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed." "Have you killed someone?" The question escaped before Eliza could stop it. Rowan was quiet for a long time. "Once. During the war. Kid couldn't have been more than 16, came at me with a bayonet. I shot him." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I still see his face sometimes, still wonder if I could have done something different." "But you survived." "Yeah, I survived." He looked at her directly. "That's what matters in the moment, survival. You can feel guilty about it later, but in the moment, you do what you have to do." The night before the trial, Eliza couldn't eat. Her stomach was twisted in knots, her mind running through every possible disaster. What if the judge didn't believe her? What if Silas's lawyer destroyed her testimony? What if she froze on the stand and couldn't speak? Rowan found her pacing the porch after dark, wearing a path in the wooden boards. "You're going to be fine," he said. "You don't know that." "No, I don't. But I know you're strong enough to handle whatever happens." He leaned against the porch railing. "You've survived everything thrown at you so far. This is just one more thing. This is different. This is..." Eliza struggled to find words. "This is me standing up and saying I matter, that what he did was wrong. And if the court says otherwise, if they say I'm lying or overreacting or that I deserved it, then we appeal. We keep fighting. We don't give up." Rowan's voice was iron hard. "You hear me? Whatever happens tomorrow, it's not the end. It's just the next step." Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to have his certainty, but all she could feel was the crushing weight of fear and the desperate need to not let down all the women who were counting on her. They left for Hardridge before dawn. The courthouse was a squat brick building at the center of town, imposing and official. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered. Some faces were friendly: Mary Bridger with her baby, Catherine Wells and her daughter, a handful of other women Eliza recognized from visits to the ranch. But most were hostile. Men who worked for Silas or owed him money. Women who thought Eliza was stirring up trouble that would splash back on all of them. Sheriff Hammond met them at the courthouse steps. "Big turnout. Judge Moreland's already inside. He's fair mostly, but he's also old-fashioned. Believes in sanctity of marriage and all that. You're going to need to be convincing." Eliza's stomach churned. "When do I testify?" "After the prosecution lays out the case, probably around noon." Hammond glanced at the hostile crowd. "Stay close to Hale. Things could get ugly when this is over, regardless of which way it goes." The courtroom was packed. Eliza and Rowan took seats near the front while the crowd filled in behind them. The air was thick with tension and body heat. Silas sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, Thomas Ridgway, a sharp-dressed man with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached past his teeth. Silas looked different than the last time Eliza had seen him. Clean-shaven, sober, almost respectable in his suit and carefully combed hair. It was a costume designed to make him look like a victim of false accusations rather than a violent predator. Judge Moreland entered, a severe man in his 60s with white hair and no patience for noise. The room fell silent as he took his seat. "Case of the Territory versus Silas Crow," the judge announced. "Charges of assault, battery, and marital abuse. How does the defendant plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Ridgway stood smoothly. "My client is the victim of a malicious woman scorned. We'll prove that Mrs. Crow invented these charges out of spite and instability." Mrs. Crow. Eliza flinched at hearing that name. She wasn't his anymore. She'd never really been his. But legally, until this trial resolved, she still carried his name like a brand. The prosecution, a young territorial attorney named James Kellerman, presented his case first. He called Sheriff Hammond to describe the scene when Eliza had been thrown from the stagecoach. Hammond testified clearly, describing her injuries, the town's inaction, and the subsequent arrest of Silas. Ridgway's cross-examination was brutal. He implied Hammond had a grudge against Silas from previous run-ins, suggested the injuries could have come from anywhere, planted seeds of doubt in every statement. Then Kellerman called Dr. Morrison, who'd examined Eliza's injuries at Hammond's request a week after the incident. Morrison testified that the bruising patterns were consistent with assault, specifically fingerprints on her throat, impact marks on her ribs, defensive wounds on her arms. Ridgway dismissed it. Couldn't those injuries have occurred from a fall? From the stagecoach, perhaps? Some of them, yes, but not all. The throat bruising is clearly from manual strangulation. The pattern is unmistakable. Or perhaps from rough intimacy between newlyweds? Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Eliza's face burned. That's not... Dr. Morrison started, but Ridgway cut him off. No further questions. Then it was Eliza's turn. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like water. The courtroom seemed impossibly large, full of staring faces. Some sympathetic, most not. Silas watched her with an expression of wounded innocence that made her want to scream. Kellerman started with easy questions. Her name, her age, how she'd met Silas, the courtship. She answered mechanically, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. Then Kellerman asked her to describe the marriage. Eliza took a breath and began. She told them about the first night at the way station, about Silas revealing she'd been traded to settle a debt, about the first blow and all the ones that followed. She described 3 days of systematic brutality, of being treated like property that had disappointed its owner. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the hostile faces looked uncomfortable. And when he threw you from the stagecoach, Kellerman asked gently, what did he say? He said I was worthless, that I wasn't worth the trouble, that he was done with me. Eliza's voice cracked, but held. He threw me out like garbage. Thank you, Mrs. Kellerman caught himself. Thank you, Miss Boone. No further questions. Then Ridgway stood, and Eliza knew the real fight was starting. Miss Boone. Ridgway's voice was silky, friendly even. You say my client beat you, yet you have no witnesses to these alleged beatings, just your word against his. The bruises could have come from anywhere, as we've established. You could have fallen, could have hurt yourself intentionally to frame an innocent man. He paced in front of the witness stand. Tell me, Miss Boone, did you want this marriage? I thought I did. At first. You thought you did. So you married my client willingly. No one forced you to the altar. No, but... And you consummated the marriage? Eliza's face burned hotter. He forced... That's not what I asked. Did consummation occur? Yes or no? She wanted to explain the difference between consent and force, but Ridgway was boxing her in with yes or no questions. Yes, but not... Thank you. So you married him willingly, consummated the marriage, then suddenly decided you'd made a mistake. And rather than admit your own poor judgment, you invented abuse allegations to escape the consequences of your choices. That's not true, Eliza's voice rose. He told me my father sold me to settle a debt. He said I was his property. He beat me for 3 days straight. Or perhaps you were simply a difficult wife and he disciplined you as was his right. Perhaps you exaggerated normal marital corrections into abuse because you wanted an excuse to leave. He choked me. He broke my ribs. He threw me from a moving stagecoach. Eliza was shaking now, fury and fear mixing until she couldn't tell them apart. So you claim, but we have only your word for the circumstances. My client says you jumped from the stagecoach in a fit of hysteria, that you've been unstable from the beginning, that this entire case is the fabrication of a woman who can't accept her own failures. I'm not lying. Tears were running down Eliza's face now, and she hated herself for them. Everything I said is true. He hurt me. He would have killed me if I'd stayed. Or perhaps you're simply a dramatic woman who mistook marital discipline for abuse. Ridgway turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor? Eliza stumbled back to her seat. Her whole body was shaking. She'd held it together, barely, but Ridgway had done exactly what Sheriff Hammond warned he would. He'd made her look hysterical, unreliable, like a scorned woman inventing stories. Rowan's hand found hers under the table and squeezed. You did good, he whispered. You told the truth. That's what matters. But Eliza wasn't sure truth mattered if no one believed it. The defense presented their case next. Ridgway called character witnesses, men who worked for Silas, who testified he was an upstanding businessman and a generous employer. They painted him as respectable, even charitable, a man who'd taken pity on a poor seamstress and offered her a better life. Then Silas took the stand. He played his part perfectly, spoke in measured tones about his excitement over marriage, his dreams of building a life with Eliza. He admitted disciplining her, nothing severe, just guidance when she became hysterical, but claimed it was normal spousal correction, nothing more. "And the stagecoach incident?" Ridgway prompted. "She jumped." Silas managed to look heartbroken. "We'd had a disagreement. She got upset, irrational. Before I could stop her, she opened the door and threw herself out. I was devastated. I thought she'd killed herself." "Yet you didn't stop the stagecoach to help her." "I was in shock, not thinking clearly. By the time I processed what happened, we were too far away. I assumed someone in town would help her, that she'd be cared for." He looked directly at Eliza, eyes wounded. "I never meant for any of this. I just wanted a wife, a partner. Instead, I got accusations and betrayal." It was a masterful performance. Eliza watched several jurors nodding sympathetically. They wanted to believe him. It was easier than accepting that respectable men could be monsters behind closed doors. The closing arguments came next. Kellerman laid out the evidence, emphasized the medical testimony, painted Silas as a violent predator. But his delivery was dry, academic. He was arguing law while Ridgway had been manipulating emotion. Ridgway's closing was passionate. He spoke of false accusations destroying good men's lives, of hysterical women weaponizing sympathy to escape their responsibilities, of the sanctity of marriage being undermined by women who regretted their choices. "Gentlemen of the jury," Ridgway concluded, "if you convict my client based on nothing but a woman's tearful accusations, you set a dangerous precedent. You tell every unhappy wife in this territory that she can escape her vows simply by inventing abuse. Is that the world we want to live in?" Judge Moreland sent the jury to deliberate. It was late afternoon by then. The courtroom emptied slowly, people clustering in groups to discuss what they'd witnessed. Eliza sat frozen in her seat, unable to move. "Come on," Rowan said gently. "Let's wait outside, get some air." They went out to the courthouse steps. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold. It should have been beautiful, but all Eliza could think about was the jury deliberating her fate inside that brick building. 12 men who didn't know her, deciding whether she mattered. Mary Bridger brought them water and sandwiches no one felt like eating. Catherine Wells sat with them, holding Eliza's free hand. Other women clustered nearby, a silent show of support against the larger hostile crowd. 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun went down, leaving them in twilight. Someone lit lamps in the courthouse. Still no verdict. "That's good," Rowan said. "If they were going to acquit him quick, they would have already. The fact they're deliberating means some of them believe you." Eliza wanted to take comfort in that, but she just felt numb, exhausted, like she'd poured everything she had into that testimony and now there was nothing left. Finally, near midnight, the courthouse doors opened. Sheriff Hammond appeared. "Jury's back." They filed into the courtroom. It was mostly empty now, just the principals, the jury, a handful of spectators who'd waited through the long deliberation. Judge Moreland looked tired and irritated. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreman stood, a weathered farmer Eliza didn't recognize. "We have, Your Honor. In the case of the Territory versus Silas Crow, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman looked at Silas, then at Eliza. His face was unreadable. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted, shouts of outrage from Silas's supporters, gasps and cheers from the women who'd believed Eliza. Silas himself lunged from his chair, face contorted with rage, but Sheriff Hammond and 2 deputies restrained him. Judge Moreland banged his gavel. "Order! I'll have order!" The room quieted. The foreman continued. "On the charge of battery, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of marital abuse," he paused, "we find the defendant guilty. Guilty. On all counts." Eliza couldn't breathe, couldn't process. She'd won. Against impossible odds, against a system designed to protect men like Silas, she'd actually won. Furthermore, the foreman added, the jury recommends immediate annulment of the marriage on grounds of fraud, coercion, and violence. Judge Moreland nodded grimly. "So noted. Silas Crow, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years hard labor. The marriage between yourself and Eliza Boone is annulled, effective immediately. The court also orders you to pay restitution to Miss Boone in the amount of..." The rest was lost in chaos. Silas was screaming obscenities, fighting the deputies as they dragged him toward the door. His supporters were shouting about miscarriage of justice. The women were crying and hugging each other. Rowan pulled Eliza to her feet. "We need to go, now, before this gets uglier." He was right. The mood in the courtroom was turning violent. Ridgway was already gathering his papers, no doubt planning an appeal. Silas's friends were making threats. They needed to leave while Sheriff Hammond and his deputies still had control. They pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Someone grabbed Eliza's arm. She spun, ready to fight, but it was only Mary Bridger. "You did it," Mary breathed, tears streaming down her face. "You actually did it." "We all did it," Eliza said. Then Rowan was pulling her out the door, into the night, toward the wagon. They drove away from Hardridge at speed, leaving behind the shouting and the anger and the courtroom where Eliza had stood up and been believed. They were miles down the dark road before either of them spoke. "How do you feel?" Rowan asked. Eliza considered the question. How did she feel? Relieved, terrified, exhausted, vindicated, like she'd just fought a war and somehow survived. "Free," she said finally. "I feel free." But even as she said it, she knew the war wasn't over. Silas would appeal. His supporters would keep making threats. The fight had just begun. For tonight, though, she let herself feel the victory. She'd faced her abuser in court and won. She'd told her truth and been believed. She'd broken something that needed breaking. And she'd done it with Rowan beside her, with a network of women supporting her, with her own hard-won strength carrying her through. The ranch appeared ahead, dark and quiet and safe. Home. When had she started thinking of it as home? They didn't speak as Rowan tended the horse and Eliza went inside. She was too tired for words, too wrung out for celebration. She just wanted to sleep and wake up tomorrow in a world where she was no longer Silas Crow's property. But sleep wouldn't come easy. She lay in Ellen's bed, her bed now really, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, she heard Rowan moving around, checking locks and loading the rifle, preparing for retaliation that might come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, appeals, threats, the long process of rebuilding a life from nothing. But tonight, Eliza was free, and that was enough. The retaliation came 3 nights after the verdict. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. She bolted upright, heart hammering, and saw orange light flickering against the bedroom window. Fire. The barn was on fire. She ran barefoot into the main room where Rowan was already pulling on his boots, rifle in hand. His face was hard and focused. "Stay in the house," he ordered. "Lock the door behind me. Anyone comes through that isn't me, you shoot them." Rowan, but he was already out the door, running toward the barn. Eliza watched through the window as flames climbed the walls, consuming dry wood like kindling. The horse was still inside. So was the cow and the chickens. Everything they needed to survive. She couldn't just stand here, couldn't hide while Rowan tried to save everything alone. Eliza grabbed the rifle Rowan kept by the door and ran outside. The heat hit her like a physical wall. Flames roared from the barn's roof, lighting up the night sky. Rowan had managed to get the barn doors open and was trying to lead the panicked horse out. The animal was wild with terror, rearing and fighting him. "The cow!" Rowan shouted when he saw her. "Get the cow out!" Eliza set down the rifle and plunged into the barn. Smoke choked her immediately, burning her lungs. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The cow was bellowing in its stall, eyes rolling white with fear. Eliza fumbled with the latch, got it open, and tried to pull the animal toward the door. The cow wouldn't budge, just stood there frozen, too terrified to move even as flames crept closer. "Come on," Eliza pleaded, pulling harder. "Please, come on!" A burning beam crashed down behind her, sending up a shower of sparks. The shock finally broke the cow's paralysis. It lurched forward, nearly trampling Eliza as it stampeded toward the door and the open night beyond. Eliza stumbled after it, coughing violently. Her eyes streamed tears from the smoke. She made it outside just as part of the roof collapsed inward, with a roar of flame and destruction. Rowan had gotten the horse clear. Now he was trying to salvage what he could, grabbing tools, throwing grain sacks away from the fire. But it was pointless. The barn was lost. They could only watch as it burned. "Who did this?" Eliza's voice was raw from smoke. "Who do you think?" Rowan's face was grim in the firelight. "Crow's people. Sending a message." They stood together as the barn collapsed completely, flames shooting high into the night. Years of work and savings gone in minutes. The horse and cow had survived, but everything else, tools, stored grain, equipment they couldn't afford to replace, was ashes. When dawn finally came and the fire had burned itself out, they surveyed the damage. The barn was a smoking ruin. Soot and ash covered everything within 50 yards. The garden Ellen had planted was trampled, boot prints everywhere, clear evidence this hadn't been an accident. They wanted us to know, Rowan said flatly. Could have done this quiet. Instead, they made noise, scared the animals, left tracks. This is a warning. What do we do? We report it, then we rebuild. His jaw tightened. They want us scared. Want us to give up, let Crow off easy. We don't give them that. Sheriff Hammond came out that afternoon with 2 deputies. He examined the scene, took notes, and looked increasingly angry. This is arson, he confirmed. Clear as day. And I got a pretty good idea who's behind it. He turned to Rowan. You got enemies besides Crow? Not ones who'd burn my barn. That's what I figured. Hammond kicked at a charred beam. Problem is proving it. Crow's locked up, so he didn't do it personally, but he's got friends. Too many friends. So what, nothing happens? Eliza heard her voice rising. They can just destroy our property and walk away? I didn't say that. I'll investigate, bring in anyone who looks suspicious. But unless someone talks, unless I can tie specific people to this fire, my hands are tied. Hammond looked genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry. This system isn't built to help folks like you. After he left, Eliza and Rowan stood amid the ruins. The full weight of what they'd lost was starting to sink in. They had no shelter for the animals, no stored feed to get through winter, no tools to work the land. The restitution from Silas's conviction would help eventually, but that money wouldn't arrive for months, and they needed supplies now. We'll manage, Rowan said, but he sounded less certain than usual. I've got some money saved. We can buy basics, build a temporary shelter. It'll be tight, but this is my fault, Eliza's voice broke. They did this because of me, because I pressed charges. Don't. Rowan turned to face her. Don't you dare blame yourself for what violent men choose to do. You didn't burn that barn. You didn't force them to be cowards who attack in the night. But if I just kept quiet, then you'd still be someone's property, or dead. And Crow would have moved on to the next woman. His voice softened slightly. You did the right thing. The fact that it's costing us doesn't change that. Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to think the fight was worth this price, but staring at the destroyed barn, smelling the ash and ruin, all she felt was crushing guilt. That afternoon, wagons started arriving. The first came from Catherine Wells, loaded with lumber and nails. Her son-in-law and 2 neighbors climbed down, ready to work. Heard what happened, Catherine said simply. Figured you could use help rebuilding. Mary Bridger showed up next with her husband and a wagon full of feed for the animals. Her husband, a quiet man named Thomas who Eliza hadn't met before, set to work building a temporary pen without being asked. I know what people are saying, Thomas told Rowan, that you're troublemakers, that this is what happens when women don't know their place. He hammered a post into the ground with 3 efficient strikes. They're full of shit. What you're doing matters. Not just for my wife, but for my daughter when she grows up. More people came throughout the day. Some Eliza recognized from the trial. Others were strangers who'd heard about the verdict and wanted to show support. They brought supplies, labor, and something Eliza hadn't expected, solidarity. By sunset, they'd built a basic shelter for the animals and cleared most of the debris. It wasn't much, but it was something. Proof that they weren't as alone as the arsonists had intended them to feel. That night, Catherine stayed for dinner. She and Eliza cooked for the volunteers who'd worked all day, stretching their limited supplies to feed a dozen people. The house filled with conversation and laughter despite the circumstances. These people weren't here out of pity. They were here because they believed in what Eliza had done, because they wanted to be on the right side of this fight. After everyone left and the house was quiet again, Eliza helped Rowan check on the animals in their temporary shelter. The horse was still skittish but settling. The cow had already made itself comfortable. Today was good, Rowan said. People showing up like that means we're not fighting alone. But it also means they're targets now. Eliza watched the horse shift nervously. Anyone who helped us today, Crow's people will remember. Maybe. Or maybe seeing this many people willing to stand up makes them think twice. Rowan secured the shelter door. Bullies count on isolation, on victims being alone. When communities come together, bullies lose their power. Eliza wanted to believe that. Wanted to think community support would be enough to protect them from men who burned barns and made threats. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true. The next week brought both hope and frustration. The temporary shelter held, and with donated supplies, they began planning a proper barn. But the investigation into the arson went nowhere. Hammond brought in several of Silas's known associates for questioning, but no one admitted anything, and there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone. Meanwhile, word spread about the verdict. Newspapers in 3 territories picked up the story, "Woman Wins Abuse Case Against Husband." The articles varied in tone. Some were supportive, praising Eliza's courage. Others were skeptical, questioning whether women should be allowed to bring such charges at all. Letters started arriving at the ranch. Most were from women sharing their own stories of abuse, thanking Eliza for speaking up. A few were hateful, calling her a liar, a whore, a destroyer of families. Rowan burned those without letting her read them fully, but she always caught enough to know what they said. "You're becoming famous," Rowan commented one morning, sorting through another batch of letters. "People know your name now." "I don't want to be famous. I just wanted justice." "You got justice. Now you're getting consequences." He set aside a letter from a women's advocacy group in Denver. "Good and bad. That's how this works." The good consequences came in unexpected forms. A lawyer from the territorial capital wrote offering pro bono services if Silas appealed. A women's group in Salt Lake City invited Eliza to speak at their next meeting. 3 more women in the region pressed charges against their abusive husbands, citing Eliza's case as inspiration. The bad consequences came too. Stores in Hardridge started refusing to sell to Rowan, claiming they didn't want troublemaker business. Someone poisoned Catherine Wells's chickens, leaving them dead in their coop with a note. "This is what happens to traitors." 2 of the men who'd helped rebuild were run out of their jobs. The divide in the community deepened. People chose sides, those who believed Eliza and those who thought she'd destroyed a good man's life. There was no middle ground, no neutral position. Every person had to decide what they stood for. One cold morning, a month after the fire, Eliza was feeding the chickens when she heard horses approaching. 3 riders, moving fast. She recognized one immediately, Douglas Finch, the man Rowan had run off weeks ago. The other 2 were strangers, but they had the same hard-eyed look of men who solved problems with violence. Eliza's first instinct was to run for the house and the rifle, but Rowan was gone. He'd ridden out at dawn to check on a water issue in the far pasture. She was alone, and these men knew it. She forced herself to stand still as they rode up. Forced her voice to stay level. "You're trespassing. Leave now or I'll shoot you." Finch laughed. "With what gun? I don't see you carrying." He dismounted, his companions following. "We're here with a message from Mr. Crow. He wants you to withdraw your testimony. Admit you lied. Get him out of prison." "That's not happening." "No?" Finch took a step closer. "Then maybe we need to convince you. Burning the barn didn't work. Maybe hurting you personally will be more effective." Eliza's heart hammered, but she didn't move. If she ran, they'd chase her down. If she tried to fight, she'd lose. Her only option was to stall and hope Rowan came back, or that they'd lose their nerve. "You really want to assault a woman in broad daylight?" she asked. "Sheriff Hammond already suspects you of arson. You want to add this to your list of crimes? Who says anyone's going to find out?" One of the other men grinned. "A lot of accidents can happen on a ranch. You could fall. Break your neck, just like Crow's other wives." So they knew. Knew about the pattern of dead women Silas had left behind. And they didn't care. Maybe they'd even helped. Eliza's hand moved slowly toward her pocket. She'd started carrying the small knife Rowan had given her. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. If they came at her, she'd aim for the eyes, the throat, anything vital. But before anyone could move, a gunshot cracked across the morning air. All 4 of them froze. The shot had come from the direction of the road. Eliza looked and saw riders approaching. Not Rowan, but Sheriff Hammond with 3 deputies, guns drawn. "You boys want to tell me what you're doing on private property?" Hammond called out. Finch's face went pale. "Just talking, Sheriff. No harm meant." "That's so, because from where I sit, looks like 3 men threatening a woman alone on her ranch." Hammond rode closer, hand resting on his pistol. "And I got a real interesting tip this morning. Anonymous letter claiming Douglas Finch was seen near Hale's property the night of the fire. Even named the 2 men with him." He gestured at Finch's companions. Funny how those names match the two standing here now. The color drained from all three faces. Finch started backing toward his horse. That's a lie. We weren't. Save it for the judge. You're all under arrest for arson and attempted assault. Hammond nodded to his deputies, who moved to surround the men. You have the right to remain silent, but I'm guessing you'll want to make a deal. Tell us who gave the orders. Maybe you don't hang. Hang. The word made Eliza's knees weak. She'd been seconds away from serious harm, maybe death, if Hammond hadn't shown up when he did. You all right, Miss Boone? Hammond asked as his deputies cuffed the three men. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't all right. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. But she was alive, and her attackers were being arrested, and that had to count for something. Who sent the anonymous tip? She managed to ask. Hammond smiled slightly. Would you believe Thomas Bridger, Mary's husband? He's been keeping watch on folks connected to Crow. Saw these three leaving town this morning and figured they were up to no good. Rode to find me right away. So Thomas had saved her. Quiet Thomas, who'd built the animal shelter and said this fight mattered for his daughter. He'd been watching out for her even when she didn't know it. After Hammond left with the arrested men, Eliza sat on the porch and let herself shake. Let herself process how close that had been. How easily she could have ended up like Ellen. Another woman found dead under suspicious circumstances. Another accident no one investigated too hard. Rowan returned an hour later and found her still sitting there. She told him what happened, watched his face go dark with rage. I shouldn't have left you alone, he said. I should have. You can't be here every second. Neither can I hide forever. Eliza stood on unsteady legs. But I can learn to defend myself better. Really defend myself. Not just hope someone rescues me in time. That evening, Rowan gave her a rifle. Not his. A new one he'd bought in secret. Lighter and easier for her to handle. It's yours, he said. Keep it close. Learn to shoot it like you mean it, not just target practice. Because next time I might not be here. Hammond might not arrive in time. You need to be able to protect yourself. They spent the next 3 days training. Rowan taught her to shoot faster, reload under pressure, aim while moving. He made her practice until her shoulders ached and her ears rang from gunfire. And slowly, Eliza felt something shift inside her. She'd been a victim, then a survivor. Now she was becoming something else, someone who could fight back. Word of the 3 arrests spread fast. Within days, 2 of the men broke and confessed. They'd been paid by Silas's business partners to intimidate Eliza into withdrawing her testimony. The arson had been their idea. They thought destroying Rowan's livelihood would scare him into abandoning Eliza. More arrests followed. The network of men protecting Silas began unraveling as each one tried to save himself by implicating others. Sheriff Hammond worked around the clock, building a case not just against Silas, but against everyone who'd enabled him. A week after Finch's arrest, Hammond came to the ranch with news. Territorial prosecutor wants to expand the case, he said. Make it about more than just what Crow did to you. They're looking at his whole pattern, the dead wives, the intimidation, the corruption. They want to go after everyone involved. What does that mean for me? Eliza asked. Means more testimony, more time in court, more public scrutiny. Hammond looked uncomfortable. Also means death threats from folks who want this buried. It'll be dangerous, Miss Boone. More dangerous than what you've already faced. Eliza looked at Rowan. He met her eyes and gave the slightest nod. Your choice. Always your choice. She thought about Ellen, who'd died alone and unavenged. About Mary Bridger, still married to a man she flinched away from. About Ann Wells, saved from a bad engagement. About all the women who'd written letters thanking her for speaking up. I'll do it, she said. Whatever they need, I'll testify. Hammond smiled grimly. I figured you'd say that. You're stubborn as hell, Miss Boone. Lucky for all of us. The expanded case took months to build. Eliza gave statement after statement, sat through interview after interview. She met with prosecutors, testified before grand juries, answered the same questions until she could recite them in her sleep. It was exhausting and terrifying and necessary. During those months, life on the ranch continued. The new barn rose slowly, built with donated labor and materials. The community that had rallied after the fire stayed involved, creating a network of support that extended beyond just Eliza and Rowan. Women started meeting weekly at Catherine Wells's boarding house, sharing stories and resources. Men like Thomas Bridger quietly watched for threats and reported suspicious activity. Something was changing in the territory. The old rules, where men's violence went unchallenged and women's voices didn't matter, were being questioned. Not everywhere, not by everyone, but by enough people that the balance was shifting. Eliza felt the shift in herself too. She was stronger now, both physically and mentally. She could shoot straight, fix a fence, birth a calf. She kept the ranch books and managed supplies. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building a life. Her relationship with Rowan changed too, though neither of them named it directly. They worked together, ate together, sat on the porch in the evenings, and talked about everything and nothing. He made her laugh with dry observations about the neighbors. She challenged his assumptions about what women could and couldn't do. Somewhere in those months, they stopped being a rancher and a refugee and became partners. One evening, 6 months after the trial, they sat watching the sunset paint the new barn gold and red. The building was finished, bigger than the old one, sturdier, built with care by people who'd invested themselves in this fight. "We did it," Eliza said quietly. "We rebuilt." "You did it," Rowan corrected. "You stood up when it counted. Everything else followed from that." "I couldn't have done it alone. No one can. That's the point." He was quiet for a moment. Ellen tried to fight alone, tried to handle everything by herself because she thought asking for help was weakness. By the time I knew what was happening, it was too late. He turned to look at Eliza. "You asked for help. Let people in. That's why you're alive and she's not." The pain in his voice was still there, probably always would be. But it was different now, less sharp, more settled. Like he'd made peace with the fact that he couldn't save Ellen, but had saved Eliza instead. "Thank you," Eliza said, "for everything, for taking me in, for standing with me, for—" her voice caught, "for seeing me as a person when everyone else saw property." Rowan's hand found hers on the porch railing. "You made it easy. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." They sat like that until the stars came out, hands linked, watching the night settle over land they'd defended together. Eliza felt something unfamiliar and tentatively wonderful. Contentment. Maybe even happiness. She'd survived hell and come out the other side not broken, but forged into something harder and truer. The trial would resume soon. There would be more fights ahead, more challenges to face. But tonight, sitting beside someone who'd chosen to stand with her when it would have been easier to walk away, Eliza felt ready for whatever came next. She was free, she was strong, and she was no longer alone. The ranch stretched out before them in the darkness, rebuilt, renewed, a testament to what could rise from ashes when people refused to let cruelty win. Eliza had been thrown away like garbage in this very territory. Now she owned land here, had friends here, was building something that mattered. Silas Crow had tried to break her. Instead, she'd broken his power over her and started breaking the system that protected men like him. That was worth every burned barn, every threat, every moment of fear, because she'd proven something important. A woman who refuses to stay broken can change the world. The expanded trial began on a cold morning in early March, almost a year after Eliza had been thrown from that stagecoach. The territorial courthouse was larger than Hardridge's, more imposing, with marble floors that echoed every footstep. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters from newspapers as far as San Francisco, women's advocacy groups, and the curious who wanted to witness what some were calling the trial of the decade. Eliza sat at the prosecution table wearing a dress Catherine Wells had sewn for her, simple but dignified, dark blue with no ornament. She'd learned that appearance mattered in courtrooms. Women had to look respectable to be believed, had to walk a narrow line between victim and hysteric. It was exhausting, but she'd gotten good at it. Rowan sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a steadying hand. Sheriff Hammond was there too, along with Thomas and Mary Bridger, Catherine and Ann Wells, and at least a dozen other women whose lives had been touched by Eliza's case. They'd come to witness, to support, to show that she wasn't alone. The charges had multiplied since that first trial. Silas faced not just assault and battery, but conspiracy, fraud, corruption of public officials, and 2 counts of suspected murder in the deaths of his previous wives. His business partners and enablers sat at separate tables with their own lawyers, all of them trying to distance themselves from each other now that the whole rotten structure was collapsing. Judge Margaret Thornton presided, the first woman judge in the territory, appointed specifically because the governor wanted someone who wouldn't dismiss testimony from female witnesses. Her presence was itself a small victory, proof that things were changing even if the change came slowly. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Eliza testified again, this time in more detail. She described not just the violence Silas had inflicted, but the system that had enabled it, the way he'd traded women like property, the officials who'd looked the other way, the network of men who'd protected him because they benefited from the same corrupt arrangements. Other women testified too. A widow who'd been coerced into selling her land to Silas at a fraction of its value after her husband died mysteriously. A saloon worker who'd been beaten when she tried to leave Silas's employment. The sister of Silas's second wife, who described how her sibling's personality had changed after marriage, how the light had gone out of her eyes, how she'd died falling down stairs she'd climbed confidently for years. Each testimony built a picture of a man who saw people as objects to be used and discarded. And more importantly, it showed the web of corruption that had protected him. The sheriff who'd ignored complaints, the judge who'd dismissed cases, the businessmen who'd profited from his schemes. The defense fought hard. Ridgway and the other lawyers attacked every witness, questioned every motive, suggested that this was a conspiracy by bitter women to destroy successful men. But there were too many witnesses, too much documentation, too much evidence that had been ignored for years. During the second week, something unexpected happened. One of Silas's former associates, a man named Carter, who faced charges of his own, broke on the stand. He'd been holding up under cross-examination, sticking to the agreed-upon story that they'd done nothing wrong. Then the prosecutor asked him a simple question. "Do you have daughters, Mr. Carter?" Carter's face crumbled. "2 girls, 8 and 10. Would you want them treated the way Mr. Crow treated his wives?" The courtroom went silent. Carter looked at Silas, then at Eliza, then down at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. No, I wouldn't." He took a shaking breath. "We knew. All of us knew what he was doing. We knew about the beatings, the threats, probably the murders too, though nobody said it out loud. We knew, and we helped him because there was money in it, and because it was easier than standing up to him." The confession opened floodgates. Carter detailed payoffs to officials, described how they'd intimidated witnesses, explained the system they'd built to protect each other's crimes. Other defendants started talking too, trying to save themselves by implicating their co-conspirators. The careful wall of silence cracked and then shattered completely. Silas sat through it all with his face frozen in rage, watching his empire dismantle itself in real time. When he finally took the stand in his own defense, he was barely coherent. The charm he'd displayed at the first trial was gone, replaced by bitter fury at the conspiracy against him. "They're all lying," he snarled when his own lawyer questioned him. "Every one of them. They're jealous of what I built, angry that I wouldn't let them control me. This whole trial is a persecution of successful men by women who refuse to stay silent," Judge Thornton interrupted coolly. "By people who want accountability for violence and corruption." "Please continue, Mr. Crow. You're making the prosecution's case beautifully." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Silas's associates received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Silas himself got life in prison with no possibility of parole, plus an additional sentence for the suspected murders that couldn't be proven beyond doubt, but weighed heavily in the court's decision. As the verdicts were read, Eliza felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but exhaustion. It was over. The fight that had consumed a year of her life, that had cost her safety and peace, and nearly her life multiple times, was finally over. Justice had been served, but it felt less like victory and more like the end of a war where everyone lost something. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. They shouted questions at Eliza. How did she feel? What did she want to say to other women in similar situations? Did she have any comment on the governor's statement that this case would lead to reforms in territorial law? Rowan physically blocked them, creating space for her to breathe. Sheriff Hammond and his deputies cleared a path to the wagon. But before they could leave, a woman pushed through the crowd, elegantly dressed, perhaps 50 years old, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen their share of hardship. "Miss Boone," the woman said, "I'm Margaret Sullivan. I run the Women's Legal Defense Fund in Denver. I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment." Eliza was so tired she could barely stand, but something in Sullivan's face made her pause. About what? About what comes next. This verdict is going to change things, but only if we push that change through. We need voices like yours, women who've lived through this and are willing to fight for others. Sullivan handed her a card. Think about it. No pressure. But when you're ready, we could use your help. Eliza took the card, too drained to process what Sullivan was really offering. They climbed into the wagon and left the chaos behind, heading back toward Hardridge and the ranch that had become home. They rode in silence for a long time. The landscape rolled past, empty and vast, the same territory where Eliza had been discarded like trash. It looked different now, less hostile. Or maybe she was different, and that changed how she saw everything. You all right? Rowan asked eventually. I don't know. Eliza turned Sullivan's card over in her hands. I thought I'd feel relieved, happy even, but I just feel hollow. That's normal. You've been running on anger and determination for a year. Now that it's done, you're finally feeling the cost of it. Do you think it was worth it? Rowan considered the question seriously. I think you saved lives. Not just your own. Every woman who pressed charges after seeing what you did, every girl who'll grow up in a territory with better laws because of this case, you gave them something. Whether that's worth what it cost you, only you can answer that. Eliza thought about Mary Bridger, who'd finally left her husband after the verdict gave her courage. About Ann Wells, who'd broken off her engagement and was working in her mother's boarding house instead. About the letters that still arrived weekly from women thanking her for speaking up. About the 3 territorial reforms already proposed based on her case. Reforms that would make it easier for women to leave abusive marriages, harder for men to evade consequences for violence, possible for women to own property independently of their husbands. Yeah, she said quietly. It was worth it. They arrived back at the ranch after dark. The new barn stood solid and complete, lamplight spilling from its doors where they'd left lanterns burning. The house looked warm and welcoming. It was smaller than it had seemed that first day, more familiar now. Every board and nail held memories of rebuilding after the fire, of long conversations on the porch, of learning to stand on her own feet. Inside, they found the kitchen table covered with food. The community had been here while they were at trial, leaving casseroles and bread and pies, making sure they'd come home to full cupboards. A note from Catherine said simply, "Proud of you. We all are." Eliza sat down heavily, the weight of the day finally crushing her. She'd held it together through the verdict, through the reporters, through the long ride home. Now, in the safety of this kitchen, she started to cry, not from sadness, from release, from the sheer overwhelming relief of having survived something that should have destroyed her. She cried for the girl she'd been before Silas, who'd been naive enough to believe in fairy tales. She cried for Ellen, who'd never gotten the chance to fight back. She cried for all the women who were still trapped, still silent, still suffering. Rowan didn't try to stop her or comfort her with empty words. He just sat beside her and let her cry until she was empty, until there was nothing left but exhaustion and the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. I need to sleep for about a week, Eliza said when she could finally speak. So sleep. Ranch work can wait. The world can wait. You've earned rest. But rest didn't come easy. Eliza lay in her bed, Ellen's bed, the bed where she'd healed from injuries that should have killed her, and couldn't quiet her mind. The trial was over, but what came next? She couldn't spend the rest of her life just surviving, just reacting to trauma. She needed something more, something that gave all this pain a purpose beyond her own healing. She thought about Margaret Sullivan's card, about the offer to help other women, about turning her worst experience into something that might prevent others from suffering the same way. It was terrifying. It meant staying in the public eye, reliving her trauma over and over as she helped others through their own cases. It meant making enemies of every man who benefited from the old system. It meant never being able to fully move on because she'd always be defined by what Silas had done to her. But it also meant her suffering wouldn't be meaningless. It meant she could be for other women what Rowan had been for her, someone who saw them when everyone else looked away, someone who offered choice when they thought they had none. By morning, she'd made her decision. She found Rowan in the barn, forking hay to the horses. The early light made everything look soft and new. He glanced up when she entered, reading something in her face. "You're leaving," he said. Not a question. Not permanently, just, "Margaret Sullivan wants me to work with her legal fund, help other women with their cases. It would mean traveling, being away from the ranch for weeks at a time." Eliza paused. "I know it's asking a lot. You've already done so much for me, and now I'm talking about leaving you to manage everything alone. So stop." Rowan set down the pitchfork. "You don't owe me anything, Eliza. You never did. I helped you because it was right, not because I expected you to spend your life on this ranch as payment. I know that, but this ranch is my home now. She struggled to find the right words. "You're important to me. I don't want to just abandon everything we've built." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dusty morning light. "What if you didn't have to choose?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you worked with Sullivan's fund when they needed you and came back here between cases? The ranch would be your home base, a place to rest and regroup." He stepped closer. "And I'd be here, waiting for you, supporting what you're doing because it matters, even when it's hard." The offer made Eliza's throat tight. "That's not fair to you. You deserve someone who's actually here, not someone who's constantly traveling. I deserve to make my own choices about what's fair to me." His voice was firm but gentle. "And I choose this. I choose you, whatever that looks like. If it means you're gone more than you're here, I'll deal with it. Because what you're doing is important, and I want to be part of making that possible." Eliza looked at this man who'd offered her 5 words in a dusty street and changed her entire life. Who'd given her work and safety and eventually partnership, never asking for anything in return. Who'd stood beside her through fires and trials and threats, never once suggesting she should give up or be quiet or make herself smaller to appease violent men. "I love you," she said. The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but they were true. She loved him, not the desperate, dependent love of someone who needed rescue, but the fierce, grateful love of someone who'd been seen and valued when it mattered most. "I don't know when it happened exactly, but I do. I love you." Rowan smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "I love you too. Have for months now, but I didn't want to say anything while you were still figuring out who you were without someone controlling you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, his hand cupped her face with heartbreaking gentleness. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Eliza Boone. I'd be honored to spend my life with you, whatever shape that life takes." They kissed in the dusty barn, surrounded by horses and hay and morning light. It was nothing like the forced intimacy Silas had demanded. This was chosen, mutual. A meeting of equals who saw each other clearly and decided to build something together anyway. When they finally pulled apart, Rowan rested his forehead against hers. "So, you're going to Denver to work with Sullivan's fund, and I'm going to keep this ranch running. We'll make it work." "We'll make it work," Eliza agreed. 2 weeks later, she boarded a train to Denver with a carpet bag that held more than just her possessions. It carried letters from women asking for help, documentation from her case to use as precedent, and a fierce determination to turn her worst experience into something that might save others. Margaret Sullivan met her at the Denver station, efficient, direct, and clearly used to getting things done despite the obstacles society put in women's paths. "Welcome to the fight," Sullivan said, shaking Eliza's hand firmly. "It's going to be brutal and exhausting, and most days you'll wonder why you're doing it. But then you'll win a case, or help a woman escape, or see a law change because of testimony you helped prepare. And you'll remember why." Sullivan wasn't wrong. The work was brutal. Eliza traveled to small towns across 3 territories, meeting with women who'd experienced the same violence she had. She helped them document their cases, prepare their testimonies, find lawyers willing to take them seriously. She stood beside them in courtrooms and weathered the same attacks she'd endured. The accusations of lying, the suggestions they deserved abuse, the attempts to destroy their credibility. Some cases they won. More, heartbreakingly, they lost. Judges who believed husbands had the right to discipline wives. Juries who thought women's testimony was inherently unreliable. Laws that still treated wives as property rather than people. Every loss hurt, but Eliza learned to carry the pain without letting it break her. Between cases, she went home to the ranch, back to Rowan and the land they were building together. Those stretches of normalcy kept her sane, working with her hands, sleeping in her own bed, sitting on the porch at sunset and talking about ordinary things like crop rotation and whether they needed a second cow. Their relationship deepened in the spaces between her trips. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. Rowan never demanded she stay home or complained about her absences. Eliza never felt guilty for leaving because she knew he genuinely supported what she was doing. They were partners in the truest sense, two people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other every day. A year after the trial, sitting on that porch watching another sunset, Rowan asked her to marry him. Eliza's first instinct was to say no. Marriage still carried connotations of ownership, of women becoming property. The legal structure of marriage in 1867 was fundamentally unequal, designed to give men control over their wives' lives and choices. But Rowan wasn't asking for control. He was asking for commitment, for a formal recognition of what they'd already built together. "I know marriage is complicated for you," he said. "Know it means something different than it should, but I also know that running away from an institution because bad men have corrupted it means letting them win. So I'm asking, will you marry me? Not as my property, but as my partner, my equal, the person I choose to build a life with." Eliza thought about it for 3 days. Talked to Catherine Wells, who'd been widowed twice and understood the complexity of marriage from a woman's perspective. Talked to Margaret Sullivan, who'd never married and didn't regret it. Talked to Mary Bridger, who was navigating what it meant to rebuild her life after leaving her husband. In the end, she said yes, not because she needed marriage, but because she wanted it on her own terms. Wanted to prove that marriage could be something other than ownership, that two people could legally bind themselves together as equals, even in a system designed for inequality. They married in the spring, 2 years after Eliza had been thrown from that stagecoach. The ceremony was small, just close friends, Sheriff Hammond to officiate, and Catherine's boarding house as the venue. Eliza wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple and practical. Rowan wore his best shirt and looked nervous in a way that made her love him even more. The vows they wrote themselves, standing in front of the people who'd supported them through hell. "I promise to see you as you are," Rowan said. "Not as property or obligation, but as a person with your own dreams and choices. I promise to support those choices even when they're hard for me. I promise to stand beside you, never over you. I promise to love you not despite your strength, but because of it." Eliza's voice shook but held. "I promise to trust you with my truth, even when it's ugly. I promise to build this life with you as a partner, sharing both burden and joy equally. I promise to come home to you, to this life we've made, even when the work takes me far away. I promise to love you not because I need rescue, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you." They kissed to cheers and applause. It felt nothing like that forced wedding 2 years ago. This was right, chosen, built on respect and shared struggle and the kind of love that comes from truly seeing another person. The reception was loud and joyful. Thomas Bridger played fiddle while people danced. Someone brought whiskey that was probably illegal. Catherine cried happy tears and tried to pretend she wasn't. Even Sheriff Hammond smiled, which Eliza had learned was rare enough to be noteworthy. Late in the evening, Mary Bridger pulled Eliza aside. She was pregnant, showing now, carrying the child of a new relationship with a man who actually respected her. "Thank you," Mary said simply, "for showing me I could leave, for proving that life continues after you walk away. I wouldn't have my daughter—" She rested a hand on her belly. "If you hadn't been brave first." Eliza hugged her carefully. "You were brave too. I just started the conversation. You're the one who made the hard choice." "We both did," Mary smiled. "That's how this works, right? One woman stands up, makes it a little easier for the next woman, who makes it easier for the one after that. Eventually, we change everything." Eventually, we change everything. Eliza carried those words into the next phase of her life. She continued working with Sullivan's Legal Defense Fund, but she also started writing articles for newspapers about abuse and survival, essays about the legal changes still needed. Eventually, a book, not a memoir exactly, but a manual for women trying to escape violent marriages. It included legal advice, resources, strategies that had worked in cases she'd handled. The book was banned in 6 territories, which only made it more popular. Women passed copies hand to hand, hiding them from husbands and fathers who didn't want them getting ideas about independence. 3 years after her marriage to Rowan, The territorial legislature passed the Boone Act, named for her despite her protest that she'd only been one voice among many. The act made several critical changes. Wives could own property independently of husbands, domestic violence was explicitly criminalized rather than just ignored, and women could file for divorce without needing their husband's permission. It wasn't perfect. Enforcement was spotty, and many judges still refused to take women's complaints seriously. But it was progress. Real, measurable progress. More territories followed with similar legislation. The women's advocacy movement grew stronger, more organized. Eliza became one of its most visible voices, which brought both opportunities and dangers. She received death threats regularly, had to travel with protection when cases got particularly high profile, lost potential allies who thought she was too radical, too unwilling to compromise. But she also received letters from women who'd escaped because of her work, women who'd pressed charges because they'd read about her case, girls who grew up believing they had options because the law had changed in time to protect them. Each letter reminded her why the exhaustion and danger were worth it. 5 years after the trial, Eliza stood on the porch of the ranch and watched the sun set over land that was legally hers now. The Boone Act had made that possible. She owned this property as an equal partner with Rowan, not as his dependent. The barn stood solid, rebuilt, and improved. The house had been expanded with a room that served as both her office and a guest room for women who needed temporary shelter while fleeing violence. She was 31 years old. She'd survived hell and turned it into something that mattered. She'd helped change laws, saved lives, built a marriage based on actual equality rather than ownership. She'd proven that a woman thrown away as worthless could become someone who changed the world. It hadn't been easy. There were still nights when she woke from nightmares about Silas, about that stagecoach door opening and the sensation of falling. There were still moments when fear paralyzed her, when she had to fight the learned instinct to make herself small and quiet. The trauma didn't just disappear because she'd won in court or made herself useful to a cause, but she'd learned to carry it, learned that survival wasn't about erasing what had happened, but about building something strong enough to hold both the pain and the growth that came after. She'd learned that being broken wasn't permanent unless you decided it was. That strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up again and again, even when everything hurt. Rowan came out to join her on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He'd grayed a bit at the temples, developed lines around his eyes from squinting at the sun during long days of ranch work. He'd also become known in his own right. Men seeking to understand how to be better partners sought his advice, asked how he'd managed to build an equal marriage in a society designed for inequality. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, handing her a cup. "Just thinking about how far we've come, how different things are now than they were 5 years ago." "Different good or different bad?" "Good. Mostly good." Eliza sipped her coffee. "There's still so much work to do, so many women still trapped, still suffering, but there's also progress, real change happening because people decided to fight for it." "Because you decided to fight for it," Rowan corrected gently. "Not just me, all of us. Catherine and Mary and Anne and Margaret Sullivan and every woman who stood up and said enough. Every man like you and Thomas and Sheriff Hammond who decided to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." She leaned against him. "This was never about me being some kind of hero. It was about ordinary people making a choice to do better." That was the truth Eliza had learned over 5 years of advocacy work. Heroes were a myth society created to make change seem impossible, as if only extraordinary people could make a difference, so ordinary people didn't need to try. But real change came from regular people who saw something wrong and decided to act despite fear, despite the cost, despite knowing they might fail. Eliza had been ordinary, a seamstress who'd made a terrible mistake in marrying Silas. She'd had no special courage, no unique strength. She'd just refused to accept that being thrown away meant staying discarded. She'd stood up when it counted, and that single act had cascaded into something larger than she'd ever imagined. "What comes next?" Rowan asked. "For us, I mean. Not the movement or the cause. Just us." Eliza considered the question. She'd spent 5 years defined by her trauma and her fight against the system that had enabled it. But she was more than that. More than just a survivor or an advocate. She was a woman who loved this land, who enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of ranch work, who wanted to build something beyond just tearing down broken systems. "I think I want to slow down," she admitted. Not stop completely, but maybe take fewer cases, spend more time here. We've been talking about getting goats for years. Maybe actually do that. Plant a bigger garden. Build a life that's about more than just fighting. You're allowed to rest, you know. Allowed to just be happy without feeling guilty about it. I know, but it's hard. There are still women who need help, still battles to fight. How do I justify focusing on my own happiness when so many people are suffering? Rowan set down his coffee and turned to face her directly. You justify it by remembering that you can't pour from an empty cup. You've given 5 years of brutal, exhausting work to this cause. You've earned the right to live, not just survive and fight. And the best revenge against men like Silas isn't just winning legal battles. It's building a life so full and joyful that their attempt to destroy you becomes irrelevant. The words hit something deep in Eliza's chest. She'd been so focused on fighting, on making sure her suffering meant something, that she'd forgotten the ultimate victory was simply living well, being happy, building a life that Silas's violence couldn't touch. Okay, she said. Okay, let's do that. Let's build something beautiful. They spent the next year doing exactly that. Eliza took fewer cases, focused on training other women to do the advocacy work she'd been doing. She wrote another book, this one less about survival and more about building egalitarian relationships, about what marriage could look like when both people entered it as equals. She and Rowan got those goats, expanded the garden, built a greenhouse so they could grow vegetables year-round. They also opened their home to women who needed temporary shelter. Not formally, just quietly letting it be known that there was a place they could come where they'd be safe, where they could rest and heal before deciding what came next. Some stayed a few days. Others stayed months. They all left stronger than they'd arrived, carrying with them the knowledge that they deserved better and the tools to fight for it. Mary Bridger's daughter turned 3. Anne Wells married a decent man who treated her with respect. Catherine Wells opened a second boarding house specifically for women fleeing violence. Thomas Bridger started a men's group focused on teaching boys and young men about consent and equality. Sheriff Hammond trained his deputies to actually investigate domestic violence complaints instead of dismissing them. The changes rippled outward, touching lives Eliza would never know about. That was the nature of systemic change. You never saw all the effects of standing up, never knew every person your courage had enabled. But Eliza was okay with that. She didn't need to see every impact to know it was happening. On the 6th anniversary of the day, Rowan had offered her 5 words in a dusty street. They sat on their porch and watched the sunset together. The ranch spread out before them, productive, beautiful, built by their shared labor. Inside the house, 2 women who'd arrived that week were making dinner, their laughter drifting through the windows. Happy? Rowan asked. Eliza thought about the question seriously. Was she happy? Not in some uncomplicated, trauma-free way. She still had hard days, still dealt with nightmares and fear, and the heavy weight of knowing how cruel the world could be. But she also had this land, this partnership, this life she'd built from nothing. She had work that mattered, and relationships based on mutual respect. She had agency and choice, and a future she'd crafted herself. Yeah, she said, I'm happy. Not perfectly, not all the time, but genuinely, deeply happy in a way I never thought I'd be after Silas. Good. Rowan's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together with practiced ease. Ellen would be glad. Would have liked seeing you turn something terrible into something that saves others. Ellen. Eliza thought about the woman she'd never met but whose death had made her survival possible, whose room had become her sanctuary, whose flowers still bloomed along the foundation. Ellen had died alone and unavenged, but her death had motivated Rowan to save Eliza. And Eliza's survival had changed the law, which meant Ellen's death had indirectly contributed to every woman who'd been saved by those legal reforms. It was a strange, complicated legacy, born of tragedy but leading to hope. Proof that even the worst things could be transformed into something meaningful if enough people decided to fight back. I think she'd be proud of us, Eliza said softly, of what we've built. Not just the ranch or the advocacy work, but this, a relationship where both people are free, where love doesn't come with ownership or control, where we chose each other and keep choosing each other. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell, 2 people who'd both been broken by violence but had somehow managed to build something unbreakable together. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no perfect ending, no moment where all problems disappeared and everything was fine forever. They'd continue facing challenges. The work of dismantling inequality was generational, and they were just two people among thousands fighting that fight. But they'd proven something important, that women who refuse to stay broken can change the world, that men who choose equality over domination can be part of building something better, that survival isn't enough. You have to live, build, create something that outlasts the trauma. Eliza Boone had been thrown away like garbage in a dusty street. She'd been told she was worthless, that she deserved her suffering, that standing up would only make things worse. Every part of the system had been designed to keep her silent, small, and subjugated. She'd stood up anyway. She'd fought back. She'd won. And in winning, she'd changed not just her own life, but the entire structure of how the territory dealt with violence against women. She'd given other women permission to fight. She'd shown men that equality was possible. She'd proven that one person's courage could cascade into systemic change. That was the lesson she'd learned through 5 years of brutal, exhausting work. Change doesn't come from heroes. It comes from ordinary people who see something wrong and refuse to accept it, who stand up despite fear, who keep fighting even when the cost is high, who build networks of support instead of trying to survive alone. Eliza hadn't been special or extraordinary. She'd just been a woman who refused to accept that being discarded meant staying broken. And that refusal had transformed not just her life, but the lives of countless other women who came after her. As the stars came out over the ranch, her ranch, owned legally and fully, Eliza thought about all the women who'd written her letters, all the girls growing up in a territory with better laws than had existed 6 years ago, all the future generations who'd benefit from the fights being fought now. The work wasn't finished, would probably never be fully finished because systems of oppression were stubborn and deep-rooted, but progress was being made. Lives were being saved. The world was changing, one woman's courage at a time. And Eliza Boone, the woman who'd been thrown away like worthless trash, had been one of the catalysts for that change. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.